Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Introverted in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 16, Revealing the Broken Bits. Hiruzen was pissed. The Sandaime Hokage stood in front of the source of his displeasure, namely, Danzo. The Yami of Shinobi was instead perplexed for barely a second that late at night, it was either a really important discussion or an assassination attempt. If it had been the latter, however, Hiruzen wouldn't have come dressed in his Hokage's robes, unless this one in front of him was a Kage Bunshin, and the real Hiruzen was actually positioning himself to strike from the shadows. Such a visit this late at night, Hokage-sama. He quipped calmly, his gaze firm. Is there something? Danzo was pinned against the wall, a kunai a mere inch away from his face as a second Hiruzen held him there firmly. The second one was wearing the battle armor the Sandaime Hokage himself had favored during his time as an active shinobi. It was pitch black and with reinforced gauntlets, somber but effective. To enter the torture and interrogation department, one needs the codes to get through the security checkpoints. Secret hand signs are required prior to and afterwards in order to ensure who enters and leaves is exactly whom is claimed to be. Aoba checked in, but Aoba isn't the culprit. So the question is, Danzo, who could know all of that? Hiruzen's voice was barely a hiss as he spoke. And if it isn't you, then you'd better give me more than just an alibi. The silence was thick. The tension palpable. It was Danzo who spoke, breaking that unnerving moment. I know who did it, he calmly whispered. And you know it too. Nobody was supposed to know. Hiruzen's kunai was removed from in front of Danzo's face. They were supposed to participate in the silent graduation. They were supposed to head over to the facility deep in the forest, to be trained for Chiryunin and maybe be set on the course for Umbu. The attack was precise and surgical. It reeks of you, Danzo. Hiruzen breathed slowly as he made the kunai disappear, the other Hokage in his white robe popping in a small plume of smoke. Then again, you would have acted less subtly, to ensure the fault would end on someone else. As it is, I can easily say the purpose was to make us doubt of Inoichi Yamanaka. Somebody has it set against the Yamanaka's clan, it seems, Danzo remarked. Or maybe against you. They can't really expect me to let Naruto's team participate fully into the exam for Chiryunin. I'll just postpone their graduation. There isn't a need to let them reach the final bout of the Chiryunin exams. Hiruzen's voice was barely hearable as the Hokage whispered. But maybe that isn't the purpose. Danzo quipped. Maybe the purpose is another, the Yami of Shinobi acquiesced. Maybe it has everything to do with postponing his Chiryunin graduation. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed. The only reason would be someone who didn't wish for Naruto to earn the trust to learn certain techniques. That level of cunningness is tied to only one person, Hiruzen, Danzo muttered. And if it's that person, then it's dangerous. So I either let them participate to promote Naruto, or I don't and I see him win. He learned from me, he'll earn something whether I do or do not act. Hiruzen brought his right hand to his temple. Why did it have to be Orochimaru, of all people, to learn best from me? Couldn't it have been Jiraiya? Danzo frowned. Will he come back for the exams? He will, or I will force him, Hiruzen snapped. Can I count on Root doing its job, and not just trying to undermine my own shinobi's authorities? When has Danzo, the time for petty word games ended the moment Orochimaru entered the picture. You know him, I know him. He learned from us both. He learned from Umbu and from Root. He knows the inside out of Konoha, and while patrols and guard signs may have changed, he has the ability to certainly discern them within an eye glance. Danzo nodded slowly, as Hiruzen kept on talking. He will destroy Konoha, Danzo. You know that and I know that. Mizuki was one of his men. Orochimaru's aim was to destabilize the Jinchuriki, because he knows he is the trump card that might foil any plan. Sheer power does that, even to cunningness, Danzo chuckled. Well, you could always let you adopt him. Danzo, Hiruzen's arms crossed over his chest. We both know that won't come to pass. I barely managed to contain the uproar following you training him on the basics. Do you think they'd let a full adoption pass? If you were to just tell me who silently stonewalls the option, or simply tell me their reasons. The Yami of Shinobi remarked. I could end it. No, Hiruzen shook his head. You've already done enough with Naruto to last a lifetime. Luckily, some things you will never be able to take away from him. You went to visit him too. Yes, the Kami of Shinobi smiled briefly at that. He was fine. He thought it a test. I suppose if it had been sprung with him actually accused, the results would have been different. You seem to forget what his dream is, Hiruzen pointed out calmly. You realize dreams change with time, Danzo chuckled. And that reality always finds the way to remove them from our imagination. Hiruzen exhaled slowly. The Churyunin exams will be tough. How will you place the teams? The usual show will have to be avoided. I can't, not without showing weakness to the clans. I already failed to protect one of their heirs and that Inoichi didn't have a spare tucked away. Really, how stupid could he be, to make his only chance of preserving his family line a shinobi and not even train her personally? He did, but he went soft on her apparently. The clock on the wall chimed 3 in the morning. Danzo knew this would be a long night, especially by the fact the Hokage seemed relentless in talking with him. Maybe the late hour had made him in need of some recollection time with another old war glory. He doubted that was the case. Sit down, Hiruzen, I'll come back with tea. We'll be up all night, I suppose. I'll help, the Hokage answered as he followed. I should apologize for nearly killing you. Don't sugarcoat words, Hiruzen. You realized I had the 4 inverted seal on my chest when you pinned me to the wall. That's why you stopped. Hiruzen just chuckled. Ah, I can never hide anything from you, my old friend. When was it, do you think, that we stopped simply talking, and ended up needing the threat of mutual destruction to keep us civil? I think it was sometime after Tobirama-sensei's death. I see, Danzo commented. Checking for poisons in the tea leaves. They know I'm here, Hiruzen quipped. Oh, well. In 5 minutes, poison-free tea was between them, on a small table as the 2 old shinobi sat on the opposite sides of the teacups and the fuming teapot. Kakashi's team is out, Hiruzen spoke. They suffered a training accident. While Kiba might still be viable as well as Ami, Sasuke won't be combat effective at least for 2 months. Danzo took a sip of the tea. The Haytake was always one for dramatics. He did it on purpose, didn't he? Calmly, Hiruzen moved his gaze sideways. I think he wanted to show Sasuke humility. If he had maimed that brutally someone else of the team, Sasuke would have probably become insufferable. At least, that's what his reasoning was. The bitter pill of humility? I recall someone who had to have it beaten into him too, Saru. Danzo chuckled. We will see if it has earned him something character-wise. You required repeated teaching of the same method, if I recall correctly. He did activate the Sharingan however. Apparently, the trauma was strong enough. Good, Danzo nodded. He frowned slightly. We don't need to fill in Yamanaka Ino's spot, but we could move the 100-year-old genin. We can place the Inyazuka in his place and have that team pass without trouble. The Gachuga can be considered a finishing move together with the Akimika Zone, and tracking can boost them as the information retrieval team. Kurene's team will participate as well, however, since they do have the Hyuga Eris and Orochimaru might target her. My operative can be moved to their team. The civilian can instead be moved. No, Hiruzen remarked. If Orochimaru's aim is Naruto, he will need whatever teammates can work with him best against the Sunin, at least long enough for the Umbu to arrive. Kasuke can move in Kurene's team in the place of Hibachi. And if Orochimaru's aim is truly Naruto, he cannot have his teammates with him, Danzo stressed back. Think about it, Hiruzen. He will break the boy as an objective, that is clear. Do you want to see the Kyuubi appear in the middle of Konoha? Keep the boy and his teammates separated as much as possible. Make it look like a fallout. Order them to act as if they no longer were together. This is as much for Naruto's safety as it is for theirs. Make this their silent graduation. Are you actually caring for the boy, Danzo? Hiruzen raised his right eyebrow with perplexity. He is the Jinhiriki of the Kyuubi, Hiruzen. The only reason Kyumo did not attack us after the nine-tailed fox passed through the village was because we lied and told the world our Jinhiriki was the strongest and was an adult. We had Orochimaru pass off as the new Jinhiriki. We had him develop his blasted seal Hiruzen so that he could better play the part. We cut him off when he began to lose his sanity, but we are the ones responsible for that. You do care, Hiruzen's tone was amused. For Konoha, I think, but you do care. Of course I care, Danzo muttered. We aren't discussing a random shinobi. The loss of the Kyuubi, the loss of the Jinhiriki, it would mean death for Konoha. We would be destroyed. Without an equally strong power, without another Jinhiriki to prevent total war, we'd be destroyed. Iwa would fall on us. Kyumo would prey on us. We survive because we have the strongest Jinhiriki, and nobody wants to battle him, should we lose him, however. What if that was his purpose, however? To keep the boy separated from his teammates. Then at the very least he will not be able to get them both at the same time, Hiruzen. We'll have the Umbu shadow them. That would draw too much attention, Hiruzen shook his head. We'll have to trust them with the mission. So, if we give both civilians to Naruto, we can move Sai to Kurene's team. Kiba will then move as planned with Asuma. That leaves us with Sakura Haruno and Kosuke Maraboshi. She can suffer from the stress of what has happened, and be considered ineligible for the exam. Danzo drawled out. However, wasting Kosuke's skills. I think we should leave Sakura out, and have Kosuke take the place of Hibachi-kun. There is a history between him and Naruto, after all. Alright, we can do it that way, but what if the other civilian doesn't wish to participate in the exams? Hiruzen's face turned slightly dark. Then we will force her. You could always promote Naruto personally, Danzo remarked slowly. His only eye pierced straight through Hiruzen's face. That you didn't even propose it, that you purposefully ignored it, Hiruzen, what are you planning? To end this, the Kami of Shinobi remarked. Once and for all, Orochimaru must be stopped, and as slippery as he is, this is the best chance to get him. When you dangle a piece of bait to catch a mackerel, you should be careful not to attract sharks, Danzo murmured. Because if your fishing rod breaks, you should retire, Danzo. The moment you began using fishing metaphors is usually a giveaway of old age. They shared a chuckle. It was hollow and held no real laughter within, and no real emotion. It was as if they had simply done so because of habit, rather than because they actually had enjoyed the small banter. So Aoba's team will be composed of Naruto, the civilian girl and Kosuke. We should bring Kosuke in on the plan. He won't accept it, Danzo spoke. We are doing no better than using Naruto as bait after all. Considering how hard he is still taking the loss of his teammates. Hiruzen nodded. I will brief the team tomorrow. At the same time as that conversation went on in Danzo's house, in Naruto's hospital room, two genin were currently locked in an embarrassing silence. Sakura had her hands clenched into fists, both firmly pressed against her thighs as she looked down firmly. The floor was very interesting. Naruto instead was looking everywhere but at Sakura. I'm sorry, Sakura whispered, her voice barely hearable. How are you? Naruto shuddered, before exhaling slowly. I'm fine, he looked at her. So, they actually asked you to torture me? You know, you've got talents with words, he smiled. It was such a bitter smile that Sakura blurted it out as soon as the thought reached her brain. Stop that, she muttered. You're not Sai, stop smiling like that. She trembled. It creeps me out, she bitterly replied. You should be screaming at me. Why aren't you? Be angry, Naruto. Being angry never works, Naruto whispered. Being angry, yelling, ranting, screaming, it never works. His voice was cracked as he spoke, his eyes mystified. People don't listen. They avert their gazes. They ignore you. It doesn't matter what you do then, they just don't care. You start wondering if you're invisible. You know, the Kyuubi's right, people just don't want to listen. His eyes widened a moment later. The Kyuubi. Sakura's voice was now holding a slightly fearful tone. Naruto, you spoke with it. He breathed raggedly. He had to say something. I did, he admitted. I was, in a sewer, the pain was so much I fainted and, Sakura's hand had gone to her mouth to suppress the startled gasp, but tears were already flowing from the kunoichi's eyes, and I ended up in front of a cage. Naruto shuddered. It had to be the chilly night, rather than a foreboding feeling of bad things to happen. The fox told me some stuff, and I listened to him. He shook his head. But it's not important. Naruto, Sakura murmured. She breathed in slowly. I should leave the team. The boy's eyes widened, as a startled question rose to his lips. Why? Sakura's eyes bulged as she clenched her fists. Why? Come on, Naruto. How can you ask me why? I did this. I'm the reason you're in a hospital bed. I'm the reason you fainted and met the Kyuubi. I'm the one at fault. Why aren't you angry at me? Why are you so forgiving? She choked on her own words. I'm not worthy of that. I'm not. Sakura, Naruto remarked. You did what they asked you to do. He slowly nudged her chin up with his left hand. And you're my friend, he added as Sakura's breath hitched again. Don't friends forgive each other? Friends don't torture each other, she croaked out. Her hands went to her face, as her shoulders moved up and down. She cried in silence, letting tears fall one after the other. Naruto was embarrassed. He had no idea what to do. He felt fine, and he had practically lost consciousness soon after being hit in the hand. The Kyuubi had patched him up completely. He was pretty sure he could leave the hospital in the following hour, if he actually wished for it. His left hand gently wrapped itself around the right one of Sakura, pulling it down. He whispered. It's fine. Really, he added quietly. I'm as good as new. You don't have to blame yourself. Naruto, Sakura muttered. Would you have done the same, in my position? She asked slowly. Would you have tortured me, had our roles been reversed? He closed his right eye, as his left was held by the bandage pressed against the side of his face. Would he have? No, he admitted. That makes me a horrible shinobi, however, you know that, he added immediately. Shinobi should carry out their orders always. You did the right thing, Sakura. Sakura chuckled. It was a bitter chuckle, filled with loathing and anger at oneself. Naruto, she shook her head as she spoke, I can't forgive myself. I can't excuse myself. What I did to you, there's no excuse. There's no way you can forgive me like this. No, you can't. It's wrong. Please don't. He smiled. He smiled as Sakura's eyes just kept on crying and producing tears, which fell down her chin and landed quietly on her lowered and clenched fists. But I do, he retorted. I do because. He frowned. He nodded to himself. Because someone has to, he replied. If I don't forgive you, if I keep being angry at you, then we will both suffer in the end. You aren't at fault. You learned from this, right? You won't do it again, and that. Sakura ran out of the room. She ran out of the room as a sobbing wreck, not even stopping to close the door behind her. Naruto remained there stumped. He fell back down on the pillows after a few seconds, when Sakura's action finally settled in. She had run away. He shuddered as he closed his only eye. The next morning, true to his thoughts, Naruto was out of the hospital. Aoba-sensei had brought him a change of clothes, and the moment he stepped out of the sterile environment that smelled of alcohol and disinfectant, he exhaled slowly. Sensei, he looked at the jounin. What happens now? First off, Aoba spoke calmly. We have developed a passcode. He gestured for him to follow and began to walk up a wall of the nearby building. When we meet, you must bring your right hand to remove dust from your left shoulder. The hello should be, hey guys, to which the others should answer with a, you're late. If one of this doesn't check, then observe install. Understood, Sensei. Good, he remarked. They sped through the rooftops, Naruto quietly watching as his sensei seemed keeping an extra eye on every single one of his moves. Was he watching out in case he was lying about his physical condition? He suspected Aoba always tested and checked his students repeatedly during the arc of the same day. Are you all right? Aoba whispered as they neared the Hokage Tower. You don't have to force yourself, he added. If you don't want to see Sakura, she was the first to want to make sure that. I'm fine, he huffed. Why are you all making this some sort of big deal? I forgave her last night. Aoba narrowed his eyes on Naruto's face for a moment. Naruto? Did Sakura tell you it wasn't a test, but someone trying to psychologically break apart the team? Naruto stumbled on the next jump, using his right hand to get enough reach for the following rooftop and pulling himself up with one smooth motion. She didn't, he remarked. But it doesn't change anything. What's done is done, right? I don't know, Aoba murmured. I mean, this sort of things. He stopped and ordered Naruto to halt too. You know, I'll tell you a story. He crossed his arms over his chest, as his eyes bore into Naruto's own. How the Kyuubi managed to regenerate his eye to perfection was something even he couldn't comprehend. The eye was an extremely delicate organ, and yet apparently the fox didn't need more than a night of sleep to do so. Captured shinobi were usually forced to torture one another to break them even further. You tortured someone else among your teammates and you could live another day. In the end people broke because of the trust they gave to each other was torn apart by the act. He muttered. You think you are fine, but you can't be. Sensei, Naruto looked back at him with a tired gaze. What do you want me to say? I'm tired of yelling. I'm tired of screaming. What should I say? That sorry doesn't cut it? That excuses should never be pronounced to begin with? I made a mistake once, and I was forgiven, with poison. He chuckled grimly. His right hand went through his dark raven hair. I even have to dye my hair to get through the streets unnoticed. I take to the alleys and the rooftops. I avoid the general population. I do what I can and yet it never is enough, is it? So what more do you want from me? This is just another shitty card, one of the many given to me, and one of the many that have still to come. I don't care anymore, he shook his head. No, he suddenly added. I think it's because I no longer am obliged to. I mean, I always thought, if I smile and ask kindly, the old lady won't tell me there are no sweets for me, or maybe if I'm nice to the Jiji in the park, he will let me on the ride with the other kids, and you know what? It never worked. I was always different. I was always the one who was pointed at, the one left alone, isolated. I cried at them and did it work? No. I yelled at them and did it work? No. I screamed. I ranted. I annoyed them and they would yell at me, finally they would look at me, for at least a few minutes. And then they would go back to ignoring me. His shoulders began to tremble. Words mean nothing. I killed the only father figure I could possibly ever hope to have. It was a mistake. They told me it was an accident. They told me the kin of paint, the jagged edge, the nicking of the vein in the neck, they told me it was an accident. The other one, the wounded one, they told me it couldn't be my fault. That a shinobi had passed by to save me, that it was normal for me to be in shock, and not remember the event. He laughed slightly. But I remembered. I remembered the other man throw a fist at me, only for Tokusan to step between us. I remembered him falling after being hit, his neck hitting against the demkin of paint that I hoped, I sincerely kept on hoping had not fallen upwards every time I remembered the scene, and yet it did, and the edge was jagged. I don't know why. I don't even want to understand why. I know it was my fault. It was my prank. His hands were clenched. What can you tell to a daughter who loses her only parent? I'm sorry. That's what, 3 words? 3 words you can say in a single breath? Do people expect I'm sorry to be some sort of miracle cure that soothes wounds? Do they expect it to work? Why ask for forgiveness then? Why insist on it? It's easy to say I'm sorry, it's easy to mean it. But is it worth it? He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a step forward. I don't know. I went to the funeral. The others, they kicked me out. I endured. I told myself I'll say I'm sorry to Ayam-san. I owe her that. And you know what? He smiled bitterly. I went to her, right in front of her, and said I'm sorry. She looked at me. She looked at me with her own eyes and answered back. That won't bring my father back, demon. A single tear fell down Naruto's cheek. And she was right, you know? Toka didn't appear because I said I was sorry. He didn't appear because I went to do the right thing and said I was sorry. Nothing changed. Then, one day, she looked at me walking along the street and called my name. She had grieved, she had calmed down, and she apologized. He bitterly gritted his teeth. Was that when she decided to have her revenge, to poison me? Were her words of forgiveness only lies? He shook his head. I'll never know, he muttered. She's dead after all, isn't she? Aoba shuddered as he took a step forward. Naruto, accidents. Accidents happen. It was a mistake. You couldn't know it would end like this. This isn't your fault. Don't apologize. Naruto's eyes were glazed over. Those words, they mean nothing. He screamed the last part. You can scream them. Yell them. Rant them to the sky. I'm sorry I'm the goddamn Jinhiriki of the Kyuubi Konoha, so please kindly stop fucking with my life. And you know what? Fuck no. We'll keep on making your life hell because we can and you can't say shit to us. He pointed his finger at his sensei. Do you know how many times I asked why, and the Sandaime lied to me? Do you know how many times I begged someone, anyone, to tell me why? What I had of different, what I had that made me glared at. What I had that made others look at me as if I was some sort of bug, some sort of horrible creature or monster. And, he began to laugh midway through his words. And they said, ask the Sandaime, and the Sandaime said, it's nothing Naruto, some people are like that, dot. He clapped both hands together, fucking fantastic. He screamed. The people of Konoha are wonderful. But I suppose, he whispered then, his eyes moving sideways. That I shouldn't hate them. Since they're just ignorant fools, right? Imbeciles who should be euthanized for the betterment of the rest. He closed his eyes, and you know what? He growled then. I don't even care about what Sakura did. I expected this. I think, deep down, I knew I'd pay for my crimes anyway. My crime, of being alive and breathing while Ino isn't. I suppose this is all there was, right? Do you want to ask me if I'm fine again, sensei? Naruto's breathing was ragged, as he wheezed and panted, swatting away the sweat from his forehead. His eyes closed as he felt the headache pounding against his brain slowly recede. This, the Kyuubi remarked calmly, is better than playing shogi alone. Fuck off. He snarled back at the Kyuubi. Naruto. Aoba remarked quickly. Naruto widened his eyes for a moment, before turning his eyes down. Sorry, he whispered. Aoba's eyes narrowed. You don't really mean it. Naruto chuckled. Seems I gave that away, I suppose, he exhaled. His blue eyes locked on with Aoba's dark ones. So? We're going to the psychiatric help. No, Aoba shook his head. We're going to take our mission, and forget this conversation ever happened. Naruto frowned. Shouldn't you be questioning my judgment or something? You see, the Jounin remarked. I do not know about the other teachers, he began, but I take the trust of my students with extreme care. Do you believe you need help? The snort the dark-haired boy gave back was all Aoba needed to shrug with his shoulders. Then there's nothing I can do, except worsen your condition. Help must be searched, not forced. And half of the shinobi force in Konoha is composed of dysfunctional individuals to say the least, due to the war. So, Naruto slowly hazarded. The Hokage Tower. Yes, let's go. And with a simple nod, the two sped off once more. There was an awkward silence as they landed in front of the Hokage Tower, which didn't last as long as Naruto would have liked. He remembered just in time to do the gesture with his hand on his shoulder. Hey guys! He exclaimed then. You're late, Sakura mumbled barely, before returning to stare away from him. Dickless, it was a single word, yet Naruto found himself smiling once more as he looked at Sai. Sai, he replied. How are you today? I heard, he remarked. Cherry can actually hurt people. It's a surprise. Sakura stood slightly apart, her hands behind her back and her gaze down. She flinched slightly at Sai's words, but said nothing else. Now, Naruto shook his head. Let's talk about something else, alright. The Chunin exams, Sai quipped. They are coming. Will we go and watch? Naruto frowned. Chunin exams? When? In 2 weeks, the pale-skinned boy said. They are held in Konoha this year. Sensei. Naruto turned to Aoba, who was barely standing aside to let his student mingle once more. Will we be going? Well, why don't you ask your team leader? He remarked. I was planning on increasing the trust part of the team a bit more, considering the recent events, so, think of me as an observer for the moment. You want to train? Ask your team leader. You want to do missions? Ask your team leader. I'll just be watching you. It was then that Sakura actually showed a spark of vitality, as she clenched her right fist in front of her and narrowed her gaze on Aoba. The Jounin merely smiled back. If everything went just as planned, he'd have them rebound from this in no time. Sakura. Naruto looked at the pink-haired Kunoichi without even the barest trace of distaste. It drove Sakura mad. How could he just so calmly accept all that happened the day before, and just forgive her? She should be happy, but even she knew the level of the mistake she had committed wasn't something that a mere sorry would cut. She had expected him to attack her. She had believed he'd yell at her. He hadn't. He had accepted her excuses and was looking at her calmly, as if it really didn't matter that she had tortured him and taken out his eye. She hadn't managed to sleep the night before. Her face had been a mess, and she had used quite some crude words on her parents too, when she had barreled back home still crying and in shock. How could he couldn't be some sort of saint. He was Naruto, and if he actually did forgive her just like that, then what had he lived through till then to simply consider torture nothing to sweat over? She was agonizing with every gaze that wasn't of hate that the boy sent in her direction. She wasn't a masochist, but this just felt wrong on so many levels. Her neck hair was standing as she cold sweated. Her throat parched as her eyes widened when Naruto assumed a puzzled frown. He should have been angry at her. Not puzzled, puzzled was wrong. Cherry. Ah! She exclaimed, jumping to the side as Sai had apparently moved extremely close to her face before whispering out her nickname. She's not brain dead, Sai stated firmly. Nor is she rotting. What do you think I am, a zombie? Sakura snapped back with a nervous tick mark on her forehead. Your face does look shan narrow. Sai was stumped on the ground in a small crater, as Sakura huffed and breathed to calm herself. As she did that, Naruto just chuckled. Somehow, hearing Naruto laugh like that warmed Sakura's heart. It felt so honest, that laughter. They reached for the mission office, but the secretary redirected them towards the Hokage's private office as soon as she saw them coming. Aoba actually tensed slightly as they stepped inside, as they weren't alone. Danzo Shimura was sitting on an armchair, placed against the wall to the right of the Hokage. Naruto's eyes looked with surprise to his private Kenjutsu teacher, before moving back to the Sandaime who seemed to sport an awfully serious face. We will be splitting your team up, the Hokage's words slashed through the air like a sword. Aoba stiffened in surprise. Sakura's gaze was wide-eyed, while Sai remained his usual impassible self outwardly. Naruto just watched. He watched in silence. Aoba's gaze remained on the Hokage for only a second, before moving to Naruto and then back to the Sandaime, all the while using the Umbu sign code to make sure the no was pretty clear. The Hokage looked at him puzzled, before turning to the team and then back at him. I understood it was something everyone wanted. No, Hokage-sama, Aoba said quickly, before the Yami of Shinobi could get even a word in. Sure, he was probably going to die in his sleep one day because of this, but he had to make sure Naruto remained with his team, no matter what. It was the only way. They have already processed the events and are all once more ready for their duty. In less than one day. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed on Aoba. Are you sure of your words, Aoba-san? I'd wager my life on it, the Jounin remarked calmly. The Hokage sighed, before stretching his back slightly as he stood up. He placed his hands behind his back as he began to walk by the side of his desk. Aoba could see a small conversation going on between the Kami and the Yami, at such a speed of signs and with such subtlety that it just seemed to him as if they had twitchy fingers, rather than secret messages, going on. Very well, the Sandaime acquiesced. In that case, there is a mission I must entrust to you. Calmly, he collected a scroll and handed it over to Aoba. It is a sirank which must be completed and returned within 2 weeks. The subtle implication was clear. The end result was even worse. If they did complete the mission, they'd end up in the Chunin exams. If they didn't, the team would be disbanded and he'd probably become the only Jounin assigned to clean the bathrooms of the Hokage Tower. He twitched slightly as he nodded once. We'll be within the allotted time span. He read the mission's title once more, just to be sure he had done so correctly the first time. Retrieval and escort to Konohagakure of Monk Sora from the Fire Temple. He turned to leave, gesturing for his team to follow him. The Fire Temple wasn't more than 2 days away from the village. They could make it with ease, and probably the allotted time was only that, to prepare them later on for the Chunin exams. As they left and the doors closed, Hiruzen looked at Danzo with a disarming smile. It appears we were stonewalled. Danzo breathed slowly. His only eye narrowed on Hiruzen. Why? Because I hold little doubt the root members looking over Sakura Haruno's family are there only because they enjoy the scent of bread, the Sandaime hissed back. I just needed confirmation that you actually wanted the 3 of them separated. Divide and conquer, huh, Danzo? That was the only logical thing to do against Orochimaru, Hiruzen, Danzo quipped back. That is if Orochimaru is actually the culprit, the Sandaime argued back. What would it take, I wonder, for Inoichi to successfully passive as Aoba, seeing as he is the one who checks every Jounin once a year for potential psychological damage or plants? Well, Danzo slowly stood up. As pointless as our talk last night was then, I wonder, were we too hasty in excluding your so-called allies from the list? I trust each of them implicitly, Hiruzen remarked. Oh, I'm sure, Danzo nodded. Trust, however, that is not something you should give this lightly. You don't trust at all, do you? The Sandaime sighed. I have paperwork to do, Danzo. And I have moles to find, and with those parting words, the two parted ways. Chapter 17, The Choice That Never Was. Leaving Konoha behind was easy. As the walls and the giant double doors of the village hidden beneath the leaves disappeared beyond the horizon, Naruto's eyes traveled once more to his sensei's back. He couldn't understand why the Hokage had wanted to split the team, but mostly, he couldn't understand why his sensei had gone against it. The words of the Sandaime eerily crept up his mind as he recalled the ease with which he had dropped the explosive tag of the news. Someone in the team didn't want to be there. He supposed it could have been Sakura, but then again she too had seemed relieved when their sensei had stonewalled the Hokage. To stonewall the leader of Konoha, he was starting to respect Aoba-sensei more and more. The Kyuubi remained quiet throughout their journey, even as they camped for the night all around a small fire that had been lit within a hole in the ground, and then covered by clay to make it seem like a makeshift oven. In that way neither light nor smoke would be visible, but the heat would still be there. We're getting to the chilly nights of September, Aoba remarked calmly. Cover yourself when you sleep, but not too much. If you sweat during the night you'll catch something in the morning. Yes, sensei, Naruto replied. Sakura nodded while Sai simply raised an eyebrow, as if he hadn't expected the teacher to specify something that obvious. Now, water? Food? Everything checks out. You don't have to baby us, sensei, Sakura huffed. We have everything. You told us to keep a backpack always ready, right? Aoba smiled slightly. That I did, he chuckled. Well done, all of you, he added wistfully. I'll take the last watch. Naruto, you can have the first one. Sakura will take the second and Sai the third one. Naruto nodded, before slowly making his way to the nearest tree and starting to climb up on it. He could feel the slight breeze ruffle his hair, as he stood firmly atop one of the medium branches. He slowed down his breathing and kept his eyes firmly settled away from the night sky and the moon. It wasn't cloudy, and while the spectacle of the stars would surely be beautiful, he couldn't risk losing his eye's night adaptation. His gaze remained fixed between the tree branches and the patches of darkness that surrounded their camp, and in the silence of the night he licked his lips slightly. The first shift in the guard was always the easiest one, as long as the day before the shinobi hadn't marched for a long while. The worst one wasn't actually the middle or the nearly last, but precisely the last one. Since one didn't go to sleep afterwards, it implied remaining awake the longest out of all the shinobi in the group. Their sensei wasn't even probably sleeping, but rather just feigning it and keeping himself ready at a moment's notice. He heard the soft rustling of leaves the next second, and his eyes moved to the source of the noise. Sai had quietly appeared right next to him on the branch, his gaze fixed on him. "Dickless," he whispered. "We need to talk." Naruto raised an eyebrow, before nodding. "Sure," he murmured back. "About what?" "Us," he remarked. Naruto blinked once. He slowly scuttled a bit further away from Sai. Listen, Sai, while I'm sure we're pretty good teammates, I don't." "Dickless," Sai deadpanned. "Us as team," he specified a moment later. Naruto blinked again. Then he chuckled lightly. "Ah, I see," he smiled slowly. "Well, what about us? You trust Cherry again?" Sai asked calmly, his eyes boring into his own. "Well, yeah, why not?" Naruto said back. He flinched as Sai's lips mouthed, rather than outright spoke, the single word. "Liar." "I now," Naruto muttered. "That's not." He sighed. "Maybe it is," he acquiesced. "But, it's difficult to discuss." "Dickless," Sai cut in. "I know you're a limp dick," the raven-haired boy nodded to himself. "But using impotency as an excuse is bad." "I." He looked back heatedly at Sai, but his throat could not hold the chuckle. "He's perfectly fine." "He." Sai cocked his head to the side. "Did you name it too?" What type of discussion is this?" he stammered out. "We're talking about dicks and dickheads, right?" Sai remarked, scrunching his face in confusion. "Or are we talking about something else?" "And no, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't dreaming all of this," Naruto shook his head. "A discussion on dicks. Is there something crasser you want to talk about?" "You know, just to leave me to my post utterly disgusted." Sai remained quiet for a moment, and Naruto dreaded the pale-skinned boy was actually thinking about it, when he finally blurted out. "Is this friendly banter?" To that question, Naruto's eyes widened imperceptibly for a second. He looked embarrassingly to the side, before finally nodding. "I think so." "It's nice," Sai quipped in his own 2 words. "Feels warm." "Don't fall for me though," Naruto replied. "I'm not, well, on the other side of Konoha." Sai raised an eyebrow. "I'm not falling for you. I'm standing on a branch, I think." He looked at his feet, firmly glued with chakra to the branch. "And you don't live far from me." Really?" Naruto remarked. "Where do you live?" "Right in front of your apartment," Sai deadpanned. "Ah," Naruto actually looked sad. "Sorry I didn't realize it. We could have gone home together." Sai scuttled a bit further away from Naruto. "Are you sure you're not gay, Dickless?" The Jinhuriki stammered and stuttered as he flailed his arms around. "And no. I mean arg. No more sappy talks at night, deal?" "Deal," Sai nodded. "What are you two talking about?" Sakura's voice was filled with uncertainty, as she slowly climbed her way on the nearby branch, before sitting down on it and letting her legs swerve gently in the air. Before Naruto could answer, Sai took the cue. "Dicks." Sakura's mouth remained half open for a moment, in a sort of perfect O, until she finally closed her eyes and breathed calmly. "Naruto?" "I'll ignore Sai." "Well," Naruto chuckled nervously. He gave a look at the slightly downcast Sai. "What was it with the boy and dicks?" "We were kind of making friendly banter." On that?" Sakura's face showed a slight blush. Is that some sort of guy-only talk?" "We were talking about cherries too," Sai added. It was a moment. In that single instant, Naruto's brain thought, wait, isn't cherry a second term for? And Sakura's eyes widened before her hands clenched into fists. Sai was completely oblivious, at least until Sakura's fist slammed him against the tree bark to the scream of pervert. Then she turned on Naruto, still breathing loudly. He flinched, instantaneously bringing both arms to cover his face. No hit, however, came. He opened slightly his right eye, and then his left. Sakura was there, breathing deeply. "You were talking about me, right?" she whispered then. "Yeah," he nodded slowly. Sakura exhaled loudly. "Really?" She shook her head as she helped Sai back on the branch. "You could have just said that. Sai, you need to talk to people without all those double meanings." Sai for his part just numbly nodded. "So, what about me?" Sakura ended up sitting on the same branch as Naruto and Sai, standing in the middle between the two. "You weren't talking of peeking on me, right?" "Nah, we'd never do that, Sakura," Naruto answered. "There's not much to see anyway, Cherry," Sai answered calmly. Sakura looked at Sai again. "Sai? You want your paintbrushes where the sun doesn't shine?" Naruto's eyes looked with shock from the pink-haired girl to his teammate and back. Sai was standing there, speechless. It was only a moment. "I didn't know you were kinky, Cherry, seems like a..." Sakura's forehead sported a tick mark. "Sai, why don't you go to bed? You've got your watch turn coming up soon, doing it with broken bones isn't smart," she finally amended. "Yes, he didn't finish, as Sakura simply slammed him out of the tree. Sai of course deadened the fall by flipping in midair and landing softly on his legs, but that did effectively quiet him down. "He didn't mean anything," Naruto said after a few seconds of watching Sai getting into his sleeping bag. "You know how he is. Completely tactless." Sakura retorted. "Yeah, I know." She sighed, her eyes moving upwards to the sky. "Hey, Naruto," she whispered. "What were you talking about?" "Really this time?" "Us," he answered with a light shrug. He watched as Sakura's face assumed a nice red tint, before he finally added, "As a team." There was a small smile on his lips now, as Sakura's own eyes narrowed to fissures. "You did it on purpose," she accused him. "Sai is rubbing off on you." "Kinky," Sai's word came out of his mouth before he could stop them. Sakura now reached the color of ripe tomatoes, as a small dribble of blood fell down her nose. "Ah, well, the mental image will scar me forever," he added shuddering. Sakura remained unresponsive for a moment. Then she smiled. "Naruto-kun," she whispered sultrily. "Speak of this with anyone, and I swear I will make you pay for it in hell," and then, quickly and quietly, she hugged him tightly. Naruto's eyes widened as he felt the soft arms surround his neck, and her hands clasp his hair gently as she brought his face down on her shoulder. She held him there for a moment, before gently whispering. "There," she muttered then, letting go of the hug. "Now we're even." And then she jumped down, leaving a red-faced and blood-dribbling Naruto to stand watch. "Let it be said," he muttered to no one in particular, "that this team is awesome." The Kyuubi just snorted, but remained peacefully quiet. His ears flexed slightly, as his nose twitched. The Ninetales growled slightly. "Oh," he finally muttered. "Ah, so that's how it is," the wicked grin of the Kyuubi spread all over the demon fox's face. "Very well," he acquiesced. "Very, very well." The monastery of the Land of Fire was a massive compound of stone, wood, and giant doors. Monks moved around with pieces of parchment or giant staffs, wearing loose robes and holding rosaries. They had probably arrived during the morning prayers, and as words rose to the air in prayer, the Kyuubi's snorts echoed louder. Aoba-sensei gestured for them to wait until the prayers were done, and as the twin doors opened up and the monks began to enter the temple again, he neared what looked like the head monk. A bald man with dark eyes and very thick eyebrows looked at them coming closer, his clothes no different than those of the other monks, except perhaps for a sash with the symbol of the Land of Fire on his waist. Next to him stood a young boy, with his right arm covered by thick gauze and secured, as if he had broken it. He had shoulder-length, dull bluish-gray hair in an asymmetrical style with a single lock falling into his face, and brown eyes. Naruto locked eyes with the boy for a moment. He felt his stomach contract as he gritted his teeth. There was a sharp spike of pain for barely an instant, before the smooth and silky voice of the Kyuubi reached his ears. So there it went, I thought I lacked something somewhere, he remarked. Naruto frowned. What went where? Something of mine, once more stolen by your race, the Kyuubi snarled. Still I wonder, no, you wouldn't, would you? He flexed his right leg slightly, tapping his foot on the ground as the head monk and his sensei spoke to one another in hushed tones. The boy has a piece of me within himself, the Kyuubi hissed. Not all of it, but certainly some. Naruto's eyes widened. Look at his arm, Kurama added. It's concentrated there. It's tiny, the amount of power, but it's there. And it calls to me. It begs me. But I know you. You wouldn't reunite us, would you? Not if the cost were to be the boy's life. Of course this doesn't mean you might not be pressed to eventually. And this here is Naruto, Sakura's voice spoke calmly as she presented the boy to him. He's usually with his head between the clouds. Hello, Sora spoke softly, his eyes hardening to steel as their gazes met briefly. The monk didn't even try and bring up his left hand for a handshake, but stiffly bowed slightly. Naruto did the same thing. Ah, hello, he replied. What happened with the arm? He asked then, wincing at his own tact. Nothing that concerns you, shinobi, Sora hissed out with enough venom to actually make the word shinobi sound like an insult. Sorry, Naruto hastily said. Well, we should be going, Aoba said walking back to the team plus the extra man. We have a long way to go. Naruto looked at Sora merely nodding stiffly towards the head monk, before slowly turning and starting to walk behind their sensei. He frowned, but said nothing. So, Sakura began to make idle conversation along the road. What is it like to be a monk? Sora looked at her sharply. What is it like to have pink hair? Do you dye it or what? Sakura narrowed her eyes, clenching her right fist. Why you? I was trying to be polite. I don't want to waste my breath, he remarked. Not with shinobi. Not with murderers. She hasn't killed anyone yet, Naruto spoke calmly. Actually, I'm the only one who has, I think, except Sensei, his cerulean orbs locked with those of the boy. So don't insult Sakura. She chose the profession, the monk hissed back. She chose to become a murderer. Not all shinobi are tasked with assassination missions, Aoba remarked from his spot. Many just take care to knock out their enemies, and usually a lot become Chiryunin because of age and end up at a desk job, the Jounin remarked. The orders to kill are largely reserved to Jounin in Konoha. This doesn't change anything, Sora remarked once more. She might end up killing someone anyway. What is it with you and shinobi? Naruto exhaled. What did they do? They killed my father, that's what your people did, he retorted angrily, shaking his head as he sped up. And now you want me back? What am I, a box to be delivered? We could arrange that, Sai said in monotone. We might need to sever a limb or two however, the pale-skinned boy smiled. I'm pretty good with my tanto. The boy monk remained quiet after that. As they camped for the night, Sora took his place against the bark of a tree, while Sai went for the first watch. Naruto sat down near Sora, speaking up before the boy decided to snap at him again. I know, he whispered. I know what you're hiding. The monk widened his eyes for a moment, before whispering. You? You're the one with the thing. Naruto nodded, as his eyes went to where Aoba was sleeping. Sakura too had lain down in her own bag, but he couldn't be sure the girl was actually sleeping or not, neither could he think the same of their sensei. Sai was probably eavesdropping, as he did usually. Why aren't you? Sora murmured, before shaking his head. I don't believe you. Hey, want to see the seal? He retorted hotly. I wanted to know if... If what? Sora hissed. If I'm some sort of monster who has to be chained against a wall? If I need daily baths in holy water to keep the beast at bay? He snarled the last part, as Naruto's keen ears heard the slight snapping of fabric. The boy tensed and then hurriedly covered his right hand. I don't want your pity. I don't need your words. I don't even care what you do as long as you stay out of my way. But... I'll be behind the bushes for a while, Sora remarked hotly as he stood up and left. Naruto just looked at the retreating back of the boy and then sighed. He had just wanted to try and tell him something. He hadn't gone that far with his thoughts. He supposed they might have found a common ground somewhere to talk of. Like the weather, or the mountain, or the hills, or the gates. Wait. The gates. His eyes scrunched for a moment, as he watched the form of a gate slowly rise. Sai, Naruto whispered. Are you seeing this? Sai was already down, clapping his hands as he took on position behind the shade of a nearby tree while leaving behind a wooden substitution of himself up on the branch. He did the same, as well as Sakura and his sensei. Not a second too soon did they manage to reach the shadows, that earthen spikes burst forth from the very ground, skewering the entire camp and exploding into lethal shrapnel of rocks. The flying bits of dirt obscured the view surrounding the now broken terrain, as the glint of metal came close to where Naruto's head had been a moment before. The boy had ducked by instinct, letting the kunai flash and cut a slight wound on the upper side of his scalp. Thankfully he had his hard head to absorb the blow, but as blood began to copiously flow down his face, he barely managed to stem the flow with his forehead protector as he began to run away from the scene. This seemed just like a repeat of the avalanche mission. Hadn't he practically been running away there too? You're just a coward. You left the girl and ran, isn't it? That's how you survived. By running away. Sasuke's words reached his ears, making him grit his teeth and clench his right hand in a fist. He barely avoided a hail of needles, which all seemed to glint dangerously in the moonlight. The weapons weren't aimed at him specifically, but seemed to simply be covering an ample area around them. Where was the rest of his team? What level was the enemy if they couldn't even sense them preparing the stage? He ducked down just in time to avoid a steel-looking staff from impacting against his face. He recoiled from the human figure, taking out his tanto and standing ready to jump or roll to the side. The enemy ninja was a female with long dark brown hair. She was wearing a strange one-piece dress of beige and black, and her blue eyes shone of a cruelty unlike any others. It's always like this, the Kyuubi whispered in his ears as the kunoichi instead attacked. He jumped to the side, just as Kurama kept on talking. They leave the stragglers to me. I wonder if Fuka will leave someone behind for me to have fun with. I don't think I'm asking for much, right? Just one enemy to try and play chess against or someone with some brain smarts, and there he goes right in the TR. He stilled and pushed forward, rather than complete his movement that would send him to safety behind a tree bark. The next moment the bark detonated, as a volley of fire and metal rained down on the spot he would have supposedly ducked the explosion. Interesting, the kunoichi spoke for the first time with her own voice, licking her lips. How did you know? Tension is broken when one speaks to another. Naruto didn't speak. He eyed his surroundings warily, taking advantage of those small seconds before dropping down on all fours. He avoided a giant shuriken that had been flung from somewhere, and then growled slightly as he charged ahead. It was then that he realized there had been steel wires all in front of the kunoichi. The moment he ended up entangled, he knew his life was done for. The sharp stone cane morphed into a sort of lance, as the kunoichi began to press the tip against his heart. Well, the woman sultrily said. I'll make it quick. He bit down on his lips as he felt the tension spasm his throat in fear. He was going to die there. He was going to die like that, trapped by an enemy kunoichi who had no reason to come after them, or maybe they had. He didn't know. He couldn't know. Let him go. A familiar voice screamed to the side of the torn-apart meadow, as a wounded Sakura charged all the way through with a kunai in her hands. The woman didn't even flinch as she simply removed the spear from Naruto's breast, and then launched it straight against Sakura's stomach. The tip pierced through the girl's stomach in an instant. Blood gushed out, crimson and fluid. Sakura's eyes widened in shock. Naruto's own seemed to freeze over the moment. Charging ahead. The woman shook her head slowly. Without backup? That's stupid. Sakura fell on her knees. Her hands went to the midsection of the lance that was closest to her wound. She felt pain beyond any other type. Was this what Naruto had felt when she had stabbed him? Was this pain what Ino had felt before dying? Was this pain? Breathing hurt. The wound hurt. Pain was her every being as she couldn't believe she felt this weak and tired. It was only a wound. Naruto had taken it. Naruto had been hit in the hand. She had been literally pierced side to side. She wasn't going to survive this. There was no way she was going to survive this. She was going to die in the middle of nowhere without having ever kissed anyone, or having done anything else. She was going to die without having had children with Sasuke or without having found out if she actually had been forgiven by Naruto or not. She was going to die there. She was going to. The kunoichi brought up another stone-formed cane and walked leisurely towards Sakura. Then, as Naruto watched, she slammed the side of her cane against the girl's head. Sakura fell on the ground with a dull thud. Nothing else happened. Nothing else. Nothing else. There was no puff of smoke. No substitution technique happened. No, this is a genjutsu, I'm alive, nothing, Sakura was, she was. Well, returning to us, the woman replied with a bored tone, as if killing his teammate didn't mean anything to her. Want to kill her? The Kyuubi smiled from within him. Want to make her suffer? I have a deal. What do you want? Naruto snarled back, tears in his eyes as he watched the Kyuubi from behind his cage. I want, Sora. Consume him. Consume what is mine by right. Consume his malice and give it upon me, do that, and I will grant you my powers for the time being, the Kyuubi smiled. But once taken, a pact with the devil is never something easy to live with, Naruto. He stammered. He closed his eyes. He could see the woman near him again. You knew of them, he finally acquiesced, looking at the Kyuubi. You knew they were setting a trap for us. Of course I knew. The Ninetales remarked. I told you, didn't I? I am the product of every single act of malice, thought or done otherwise. Whether I choose to tell you about them or not is not something you can change. I give unto you what I desire to give, and keep silent when it fits my needs. What, you thought we were some sort of friends, where we looked out to one another? Naruto screamed to the sky of his sewer-like mind as he brought both hands to his face. You let Sakura die. But Naruto. You wouldn't have said anything anyway. The Kyuubi gleefully replied. You didn't with Ino. You wouldn't have with Sakura either. And Naruto locked eyes with the Kyuubi again, and in that single exchange, the Kyuubi smiled and Naruto understood that the fox was right. Hadn't he always been right? He might have tried something, but he wouldn't have told. He would have kept quiet. He wouldn't have said anything about the Kyuubi, because then, they would have taken him away from his team, right? They would have been afraid of him, influenced by the Kyuubi and all. He was the problem. From the very beginning. I accept, he whispered. Fien had watched the boy stop moving and fighting back with disinterest. She wasn't going to waste any more time on this. She twirled her staff, preparing to strike. When she was pulverized to minuscule amounts of nothing. Scorching hot fire burned and melted off the steel cables that held Naruto still, as pure bright chakra flared in the sky. The very ground seemed to be lit with renewed intensity, as blades of grass grew from the ground as if centuries had passed. The trees reached for the skies, as Naruto took a step forward numbly. Kill kill kill. Murder. Slaughter. My daughter. You whore. Die sick fuck. Kill them all. Your husband is ugly, you bitch. Slice the neck and move. Pour the oil on his head. Bastard child, I'll teach you to be late again. Tear him apart, bro. You need to pay with your body, ma'am, this isn't enough. Your daughter will fetch a nice price. Evil, darkness, blood, gore, death and decay. Malice pure and unbridled. So why was the world happy to see him again? Naruto fell on the ground near Sakura, the flames of white chakra leaving him as he gently touched the girl's face. Without the woman, the rock spear had disappeared, leaving behind a bleeding wound that would have killed the girl in seconds, if it had still been bleeding. He croaked out, tears in his eyes as he slowly crawled near the dead kunoichi. I'm sorry, Sakura. And then he closed his eyes. He opened them again to pitch black darkness. He could hear the sound of paws slamming against the ground, as well as the familiar voice of Sai muttering something. A few seconds later, and the black darkness revealed itself to be ink, as the conjured lion fell apart to drop him against a tree branch. Sai held his right hand firmly fixed in the silence gesture, before pointing towards Sora, who was looking vividly shaken and afraid, hanging from an upper branch. Naruto stared at Sai dumbly. Was this? He turned his gaze around frantically. Where was Sakura? Sai seemed to have understood his silent query, because he pointed to a branch right behind them. His heart froze as he literally widened his eyes beyond norm to stare at the pink-haired girl, with a glaring hole in her uniform's chest piece, give him back an awry glance. She probably believed his gaze transfixed to her skin that showed from the hole, because the next instant her arms went up in a cross position in front of it. Sai's hand slammed against his mouth quickly, and once more the pale-skinned boy reiterated the silence. He pointed to the direction of Konoha. Naruto nodded back. They began their silent dash through the trees, taking turns in carrying Sora across. It was only as Naruto finally breathed in relief after 2 hours of uninterrupted running that he finally realized what the nagging sensation in the back of his brain was. Sai, he whispered. The pale-skinned boy didn't glare at him, so he supposed they were outside the danger zone. Where is Sensei? Ah. Sakura gasped too, nearly missing her next step as her hands flew to her mouth. He frowned and turned around just in time to watch the pink-haired girl wipe away her tears. M.I.A., Sai remarked calmly. Missing in action. Naruto was puzzled. Maybe their sensei had simply fought them off, and had yet to rejoin them. Aoba-sensei wouldn't have died from something like this. He was a jounin. There was no way a jounin was meant to die in a C-rank mission. Jounins were tough. They could survive nearly anything. And this was a C-rank, wasn't it? I am waiting, the Kyuubi remarked calmly. Naruto's eyes widened as he realized he had a different type of problem to solve. Consume what is rightfully mine. How was the Kyuubi expecting that? He wasn't a giant fox. There was no way he could actually eat Sora or consume him. And he doubted he'd be able to eat the... Oh, no, the fox didn't want that, right? There was no way. Feast through his belly to his chakra, feed upon the energies that are mine by right, yes, it was. The Kyuubi wanted him to literally eat Sora. There was no way he was going to do that. You would break your promise with me? The Kyuubi asked calmly, his voice sleek and frozen as ice. Somehow, that thought was even worse. The Kyuubi hadn't actively been trying to escape, at least, he had been pretty civil and helpful. If not for his way of timing things, to make him feel like dirt. Guys, he finally acquiesced. He knew what he had to do. It was the only way. I can talk with the Kyuubi. He wants me to eat Sora. Sai didn't even flinch as he held the monk on his back. Sakura just muttered from behind him. Dickless, Sai quipped in. Using the nine tails as an excuse to enact revenge is not the correct way of approach. The pale-skinned boy then turned his right eye towards him. The objective is not at fault. Whoever assigned the mission is. He bit his lips. How could he convince them without revealing he had actually let Ino die because he didn't trust anyone else with the mind-reading information of the Kyuubi? Futile, isn't it? The Kyuubi remarked dryly. Once you dig your own tomb, you can but lie in it yourself. Aoba-sensei will be fine, Naruto, Sakura said then, her voice slightly cracking. He was behind me. He told me to run, to follow you and Sai. Sai went for Sora, and Aoba-sensei remained behind to catch the enemy's attention. He'll be fine. He heard the whispered words that followed however, and those did nothing to soothe his nerves. He has to be. And in the silence, they stretched their running until they collapsed a few hours of travel away from Konoha. A patrol should pass by any moment, Sai remarked then. This was the meeting point with Sensei if we were lost. 2 hours rest. If he doesn't show, we have to go. Naruto nodded numbly, as he watched Sakura drop down Sora from her back. The monk seemed slightly embarrassed at having been carried by a girl, but remained quiet as they lay there in silence, all four of them. Why were they hunting you? Sakura asked then, looking at the monk. They weren't after us, but you. I. The monk gritted his teeth. I've got some of the Kyuubi chakra inside of me. Sakura's eyes widened, before turning to Naruto, who simply nodded back. The Kyuubi confirms it. He's pretty pissed about it, actually. If he wants it back, he just has to ask, Sora snapped at Naruto. It brought me nothing but misery. See this? He gestured at his right arm. The bandage had gone off and it now showed a slightly red and furred limb, which seemed more like the claw of a feral animal than an actual hand. The more I'm angry, the more it grows horrible. Malice feeds me, the Kyuubi commented offhandedly. He should be thankful it did not devour him whole. I lost myself to anger once, he acquiesced. Over such a stupid thing too, the older students, they just harassed me a bit and I yelled at them. He shook his head. It took the head monk to stop me. I had killed 10 monks in training and 3 elder monks before he managed to do that. He brought his left hand to his face. I was treated no better than a monster after that. Who placed the chakra into you? Naruto asked them slowly. My father, Sora answered. He wished to help Konoha. He thought that the Hokage would be favorable for it, but the seal is too weak. I can't control myself. If I lose myself to anger, then I just go on a rampage. His breath hitched. And I don't know why they were looking for me. The head monk just told me the Hokage wanted me back in Konoha for some reason. It was Sai who broke the silence. There was an attempt at the Jinhiraki's life in Konoha recently, he spoke calmly. Whoever did this might be looking for the Kyuubi. You probably are a target too. Naruto remained silent as he remembered the way Aoba had told him of the test. He didn't add his own words to Sai's tale. He just kept his senses stretched, trying to grasp if they were being followed or not. He couldn't stop and think about Sora's past, similar and yet different from his own, because at the moment he was still beneath the effects of adrenaline. The tension was palpable in the air, however, as well as the guilt that underlay every single gaze of Sakura towards Naruto. There was also something else behind the guilt. Curiosity probably, since the girl had been practically sure she was going to die back there, and yet she hadn't. She had felt the cold grasp of death linger and then leave, but she couldn't understand how. Even the skin where she had been hit was new, unblemished, unscarred. More than a target, the Kyuubi whispered in Naruto's ears. Soothingly gentle and yet extremely gleeful as it spoke. But a bomb ready to explode. Naruto frowned. He didn't understand. What was the Kyuubi speaking of? I think you will enjoy the ending of this tale, for it is already written, the nine-tailed fox said once more. Naruto didn't understand, but he bit his tongue and waited with the others for the 2 hours required. Nobody came. Naruto's heart constricted as if heavy steel wire had been serrating against it, while Sakura began to sniffle softly as they started to walk once more towards Konoha. They stood defeated. Their sensei hadn't come. For all purposes. Aoba Yamashiro was dead. Killed in action. He had probably held off the rest of the ambushers to give them time to escape. He had sacrificed himself for the team. Somehow, that made everything worse. If only they had trained more. If only they had been stronger. And yet, it hadn't mattered in the end. When was it going to matter then? How many more deaths were they supposed to live through? Naruto was just thankful for Sakura's miraculous healing streak. He had little doubt on who had provided it, but he was too tired to even begin pondering the why. If the Kyuubi actually had a heart, then he didn't want to know anymore, because it would mean that the demon fox had been telling the truth all along about not only the sage, but his very purpose. And if he was telling the truth, then Naruto was actually responsible for every single death that happened in the world because of anger, or hatred. He was responsible for Ino's death, but also for Aoba's and those of the civilians. He was responsible, and he was too weak to do something about it. They saw the gates nearing, opening up as the sun was starting to shine high in the sky. They had run for the entire night, and barely caught their breaths. They were tired, disheveled, bloodied and limping as they began to pass through the gates. It was then that a shadow dashed out of the nearby ground and slammed Sora away from the rest of the group, pushing the boy monk against a tree trunk. The figure took only a moment to pronounce 2 single words, bringing his right hand straight against Sora's stomach, the fingers lit with small flames of blue chakra. Gajyokin. Before disappearing in the ground a second later. Bewildered, everyone watched as the monk slowly but surely began his transformation as vile and putrid chakra poured out of his very skin and blood, burning the tree Sora had been flung across to ashes. It was then that the gate guards came outside. "Isn't that Team 13? Naruto heard them exclaim. "What the hell is that?" He watched with morbid fascination as Sora fell down on four limbs, tails slowly forming on his back as pure crimson chakra tinged itself dark and black from the burning blood that was consumed by it. "The story is at its end," the Kyuubi said simply. "Consume him, or die." Just as he said that last word, the beast attacked. Naruto had barely the time to bring up both of his arms in a cross guard, when the creature slammed against him and literally flung him backwards. He could hear his bones break, blood gushing out of his punctured lungs as the attack had connected with his chest and torn through him. Claw-like appendages birthed from the sick chakra cloak slashed in the air in the same spot he would have been a moment longer, if an Umbu-masked shinobi hadn't appeared to shunshin him away. "Medic!" The Umbu barked out the order as he dropped Naruto on the rooftop, before disappearing once more into thin air. "It hurts." He felt something stir within him. Memories? "Dad? Where are we going?" "Someplace safe." "Liar." "Oh? And why would I lie to you, Sora?" "Because I'm a monster, right?" "You're not a monster." Naruto watched as the kunaus flung by a team of 3 Umbu were deviated by the chakra cloak of the beast. He watched as the dark claws of chakra tore through the closest building, before bringing back 2 Chunin-dressed shinobi and slamming them one against the other. Their bones broke with sickening crunches that Naruto could hear from his own spot. His breathing grew ragged as his heart sped up a few beats. He looked at the white robes of the Hokage coming closer at incredible speed. "This is your last chance," the Kyuubi whispered. Sora's monster form turned its head towards Sai, who had been penning ink lions to distract him, while Sakura was trying to pelt the thing with shurikens. "What stays your hand, Naruto?" the Kyuubi remarked. "The fact that he is like you? Well, you can't do anything to stop him now. His seal is disappearing." Naruto watched as Sora seemed to be expanding. "You know you should listen to me and consume him now," the fox remarked dryly. "This is your last chance to listen to me, Naruto. You should trust me." He shook his head, gritting his teeth. Somehow, he imagined the Kyuubi to be smiling. "Don't say I hadn't warned you." And then, Sora grew to the point where he looked more like a round type of ball than a four-limbed fox. It was just as the 5th tail was about to appear, that cracks of pure red appeared on the surface of the boy. "In the end," the Kyuubi remarked calmly, "you will pay the price." The fox sighed. "WH. The price for not listening." And Sora screamed. "It hurts. Make it stop. Help me." Red scalding hot chakra poured out from the holes and the cracks of the creature that once was Sora, slamming against the ground and burning to a crisp the nearby buildings. Umbu had relocated his teammates, but what truly frightened him was the giant earth dragon created by the Hokage engulfing the pseudo-jin hierarchy being ripped apart from the strength of the chakra itself. And then Naruto watched as the torrent of crimson chakra whirled in the air, like a snake waiting to strike, before soaring through the sky and hitting him straight in the stomach. Naruto screamed as the crimson chakra reunited with the Kyuubi. "As I was saying," the Kyuubi sweetly whispered. "Consuming him would have avoided all this," he remarked. "Who knows, had you eaten him before leaving the temple, before meeting the enemy, maybe Aoba would still be alive." Naruto fell with his back against the rooftop, breathing hard as he began to cough and sputter out blood. He heard the soft approaching of footsteps, and then saw with the corner of his eyes the white robes of the Hokage. "Naruto." "I'm pathetic," he acquiesced, closing his eyes. I'm really pathetic, Gigi," he whispered once more. "Aren't I?" "What happened here wasn't your fault," the Hokage remarked. "It was mine." Naruto's eyes snapped open a moment later. Hiruzen took a step back, as the eyes that looked back at him no longer held the deeply blue cerulean color that made Naruto recognizable, but a dark red tint with a feral slit. His eyes. His eyes were those of the Kyuubi, and they stared with their crimson hatred at him for a moment more, before they slowly returned to normal. What do you mean, Hokage-sama? And Hiruzen took a deep breath. Shouldn't we discuss this somewhere else? Like a hospital for yourself. I want my team, he replied calmly. I'm not going anywhere unless they're with me. Good thing they've been brought to the hospital then, the Sandaime sighed. Let's go, Naruto. And the boy did just that, as he slowly stood up and followed the Sandaime. Using them as bait to lure out Orochimaru's lackeys worked, the Kyuubi whispered in Naruto's ears as the boy looked at the back of the Hokage with ill-conceived hatred. He didn't expect us taking Naruto out on a C rank immediately. Aoba's loss was within parameters, and Kakashi will foster this team to the Chunin exams then, the nine-tailed fox added slowly, glee filling his voice. As long as everything works, then Orochimaru will be brought down in due time. The Kyuubi stopped talking then, merely taking time to look around the walls of the cage he was in. He could see the cracks already. When the events finally would catch up with his jailer, when he would finally realize just what had happened, then he was sure they would crack even more. You are the one pathetic, a female voice whispered to Kurama's ears from the corner of his jail. Truly pathetic. Lying to a child. Shut up, he snarled back. This could have been avoided. You should have just let me go, rather than sealing me again. I told you this would happen, but did you listen? No. So shut up and suffer the consequences of your actions. You can't pin all of this on me. Your power was too great to let go uncontrolled. Live with that excuse for as long as you like, but it will change nothing. Your race will pay the price of hubris, and I will laugh upon the broken bones of your descendants. You are a blight left unchecked long enough. The female voice stopped talking then, and the Kyuubi growled one last time in the direction of the wall, before finally turning his attention back to the shogi board. He removed a piece from his enemy's position. There still were a few, but in the end, they would all disappear, one by one. He'd make sure of that, and he'd make sure it would happen only when it would hurt the most. Chapter 18, The Aftermath of Words. The hospital staff seemed wary with him, but the murderous gaze of the Hokage could do miracles. He found himself in the same room as his teammates, and suddenly a pink crying blur was hugging him for dear life. You're alive! Sakura exclaimed between tears. When I saw the creature attacking you, I thought with all that blood. Dickless can't die, Sai remarked calmly. He has to be lucky somewhere, right? Glad to see you too, Sai, Naruto sighed back. Sakura stopped the hug a moment later with a small eep noise, as she realized the Hokage was in the room together with them. The Sandaime just chuckled lightly, before his face grew serious a moment later. Naruto didn't want me to debrief him without you too, he began slowly. Clearly, he smiled slightly, the teaching of the leaf aren't wasted with your team. Naruto scratched the back of his head, moving his gaze downwards and sideways, clearly embarrassed by the praise. Sakura had a light smile on her lips, since being praised by the Hokage was no small feat. Sai remained his usual emotionless self. Hokage-sama, we are ready for debriefing, Sai finally said, standing to attention. Naruto soon imitated him, and so too did Sakura. As they stood one next to the other, shoulder to shoulder, the Hokage smiled briefly at them for a second more. Very well, the Hokage nodded. I will ask your written reports later, but for the moment know this, I am extremely sorry to say that we already had suspicions of a dangerous character trying to move against Konoha's Jinchuriki, but since we needed to have some confirmation, we moved out quickly to secure what else could be tied down to him. We were used as bait. Sai remarked coolly. Indeed, the Hokage nodded stiffly. Any trace of elderly grandparent was removed from his face. This was a mission necessary for Konoha's survival, and the risks of the mission were taken into account, but we needed that confirmation. For what? Naruto muttered. Our sensei died for what? I cannot tell you at the moment, it is a matter of national security, Hiruzen spoke firmly. You may choose to hate me for this, but this was a choice I, as Hokage, had to make for the good of the entire village. I suspected all along, but now we have a clear idea of the enemy's true objective. His cold gaze settled on Naruto. They have found a way to free the Kyuubi, and you are the most likely target for it. In shocked silence, Naruto just stared with wide eyes as the Hokage kept on talking. We can be assured they will act during the time frame of the Chunin exams. The Hokage's gaze settled on Sai. And with the help of an old friend, we have also uncovered a few spies in our midst. I gave you the mission abruptly specifically because it was something unpredictable. I shouldn't have sent your team, because you were being targeted. By doing that we managed to catch the spies trying to deliver the message to the outside. Hiruzen's voice slowly died down. And we have found the remaining members of the cell too. I will not disclose their names, but we are getting closer to the enemy thanks to your mission. Bringing Sora in the village was never part of the real mission, right? Naruto muttered back. He was just a tool to be used. Hiruzen exhaled a long breath. Unfortunately the Hokage's title is not a simple matter of putting a hat on your head and stamp papers. The good of the village must come before the good of the individual. We have uncovered a spy cell within Konoha itself, and the price we paid is nothing when compared to the safety of all those who live in the village. Naruto eyed the Hokage warily now, his cerulean orbs moving from him to his teammates and then back. Are we tools, too? You are shinobi, Hiruzen remarked firmly. Your duties are many, your privileges few. You are military. You are leaves that shield the tree, the branches that hold steady against the wind. You are the bark that defends against the elements and the roots that anchor the trunk to the world. You are shinobi, and sometimes you are family, sometimes you are friends, sometimes, yes, sometimes you are also tools. The Sandame's eyes grew icy. But you are never only tools. This might seem jaded or maybe it is jaded, but you should know that it is not easy to send men and women to their death every single day, and expect them all to come back alive. Out of 100 missions, 1 or 2 fail. Out of 1,000, there can be deaths. Out of tens of thousands, there most certainly is at least someone who dies. Hiruzen sighed once. All I can do is offer my condolence to your team, and warn you that you will be given time off to grieve, but not much, because Konoha needs you. A new sensei will be chosen soon. I'll send a message when the time comes. And it was then that it came crashing down. The realization that Aoba was truly dead. That their sensei wasn't coming back. Sakura was first to sniff, clenching her hands tightly as she tried her hardest not to give in to the pain. A shinobi doesn't show his tears, she mumbled. Right, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen nodded once, before turning around and moving to leave. Nothing forbids dust in the eyes however, and with those words the Sandame left quietly, closing the door behind him. Sakura began to sob, tears streaking down her cheeks and her chin, as her shoulders moved up and down trembling while her hands went to cover her face. He's dead, Aoba-sensei is dead. Sakura, Naruto whispered coarsely. The pink-haired Kunoichi stopped trembling a moment later, before wiping away her tears quickly and shaking her head. She then slapped both of her cheeks and said, with her voice still cracked by emotion. No, she muttered. We can't cry, she added softly. He wouldn't have wanted that, would he? She coughed slightly. He would have wanted us to become the best team ever, right? Just as planned. Naruto's lips twitched in a small smile. Sai just looked at his two teammates with some perplexity. He didn't understand why they were crying. He had had a brother once, and he had died, but he hadn't cried then. Death happened in the shinobi world. You could enjoy being with someone, but crying for his death? One should cry for the destruction of the village. One should cry for his own failings. One shouldn't cry for another shinobi's death. He didn't tell that to his teammates however. Cherry, dickless. Sai remarked slowly. We should plan. Sakura nodded firmly. We should. Sensei would have wanted that, Naruto finished. He clenched his right fist tightly. Let's do this then, he added. Naruto. Sakura asked then, curiosity etched on her face. The Kyuubi, does he really talk to you? Naruto sharply drew in breath, before nodding once quickly. He began just recently, he added, but sometimes it's difficult to hear him. Lies and deceits can hold only for as long as the soul can, the Kyuubi remarked from his invisible spot behind Naruto's ear. His voice was calm and leveled, but Naruto could feel now the underlying tone of revenge just begging to come out. He began to sweat slightly. The Kyuubi couldn't leave the seal, right? He would have tried when Naruto had been a child otherwise. Yet he couldn't help but think there was something fishy about the entire ordeal. Why not escape before? Why wait? He could have tried to ingratiate him earlier, lie to him and get freed. No, Minato would have appeared then, wouldn't he? Using your brain will get you nowhere, the Kyuubi said calmly. And I am not inclined in answering your questions, considering how you miserably failed my test. Because you think it's easy, trusting you, Naruto muttered back. Sakura and Sai both looked at him perplexed, and he quickly caught on as he widened his eyes and shook his head. Sorry, I was talking to him. Is it safe? Sakura whispered. I mean, it's the Kyuubi. It nearly destroyed all of Konohagakure. A pity I missed her crib, Kurama snorted. People who say the obvious are appalling to talk to. Naruto shuddered. He is pretty clear-cut, he muttered. And I'd be dead without him to heal my wounds. I am not your glorified nurse, boy, Kurama remarked. I am doing it because you cannot keep breaking splinters the same way you can break a tree. I could care less whether you live or die. Still, the Hokage knows, right? Sakura said. If he's fine with it. He doesn't, Naruto hastily said, looking down at the floor of the hospital. You two are the only one I trust with this. But, Sakura stammered, that's not done. It could be treason, Naruto. I am with Cherry, Sai said then. He quieted down for a second, before adding. For sake of clarification, no, I have not become a woman nor do I have a cherry on my body. Another heartbeat of silence passed by. And I am not pregnant with a fruit. Sakura looked at Sai with her eyes wide. Naruto brought his right hand to his mouth. The next instant, Sakura began to giggle as Naruto just laughed in his cupped hand, tears streaking down his face. Sai. That was horrible, Sakura muttered, drying off the few tears that remained on her face. Really horrible. So, where do we go now? Naruto asked, looking at his teammates. My parents are going to be worried sick, Sakura said. I should probably go back home. How about we meet tomorrow? At Hebai for lunch? She asked then. Naruto nodded. I'll be there, Sai said. Dickless, Cherry, and then, opening the window, he leaped out. He couldn't take the stairs, could he? Naruto muttered. We're checked to go, Sakura muttered, her eyes lingering over Naruto. You sure you're fine? She asked then, biting her lip. There was so much blood. I told you before, Naruto sighed. I'm pretty much indestructible as long as I survive a battle. The Kyuubi's pretty much of a bastard, but he's fair to his deals. Not like you, the Kyuubi offhandedly added. But one of us has to be the voice of truth, honesty, and reason, right? Naruto flinched. He clenched his right hand as Sakura waved him goodbye and left, leaving him alone in the hospital room. He still had to be checked by a medic, but he doubted they'd find much else. As he on the nearby bed, in wait for a nurse to come check him up, he pondered. Was he really doing the right thing, acting as he was? He could have told all the truth or a lie from the beginning. He had settled for half-modeled falsehoods and misguided words. Was this what being a shinobi really was like? Never to claim the truth, never to speak a lie? He shook his head slowly as he watched the door open and a nurse come in. She gave him a single look over, not even coming close to touch him, before remarking coldly. You can leave, there are people who are really hurt that need the room. You know, the ones that cousin of yours wounded on his rampage. He wasn't my cousin, Naruto muttered as he stood up. Monsters all share the same family, don't they? The nurse remarked with frost in her voice, before turning her back to him and leaving him standing there, in silence and with his eyes wide. Surely they wouldn't, the people wouldn't. And why not? The Kyuubi asked, with a voice filled with nonchalance. A Kyuubi-like creature wounded and killed people today, near the gate, when Team 13 returned with their little pet Jinhiriki. The Hokage himself fought the aberration, and reports say the energy entered the Jinhiriki. Who wouldn't think you had something to do with it? But I'm innocent, Naruto meekly added as he began to walk outside, through the hallway. He watched as nurses and doctors pushed by shinobi on trolleys, urgently demanding blood and clean rooms to operate in. He could hear them scream about cauterizing, or blood loss. Had Sora caused this? As am I, Kurama replied. You cannot claim I didn't give you a choice, the Kyuubi remarked. I told you to consume him, the fox added. I even forced your hand to test your very honesty, there was a deep growl now in the Ninetales' voice. And this is your entire fault, Naruto Uzumaki. You paid the price for not listening, once more. How many times, I wonder, will you pay it before you understand? You're the Kyuubi, not me, he mouthed to himself as he left the hospital, avoiding as much as he could the glares of the families who had come urgently by, those of the people who were talking one to the other and pointed at him. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even been fighting. He had been wounded among the first. Maybe, Kurama acquiesced. But you are the one who refused to speak. You are the one who refused to heed my warnings. You are the one who keeps on closing his ears to my words. I do not care whether you live or die, Naruto. All I care is to be set free. You Uzumaki have unnatural longevity and vitality. Your mother survived the extraction of me from her body, even when done by force. You'd just have to let me go, Naruto. I can teach you the way. I'd be gone, back to doing my job, and I would never attack your friends again. Konoha would know, he muttered as he shook his head. And they would ask me how it is possible for the Kyuubi to have disappeared, and even then, I can't trust you. You see, Naruto. The Kyuubi wistfully said. In the end, your words admit the truth you try to hide. Slowly, Naruto could see the fox rise on its paws. You are no better than the jailers before you. You know of my innocence by now, and yet you persist only because of your own selfish needs. The world is suffering, screaming in anguish for me and my brethren, but you do not care for it, do you? No. It is only I who is important with you humans. The good of the humans before the good of the world. The Kyuubi snarled. I thought you different. Silence for a split second. I was wrong. You are worse than the others, you go as far as faking to listen. Naruto breathed slowly, his eyes were stinging and he didn't at all feel as some sort of lucky survivor. Aoba was dead, the Kyuubi was literally tearing him apart with words, and if he had been truthful then the Hokage had used them as bait from the beginning. And even worse. He was the only one to blame for all of this. He had had the chance to make things right. He had had the possibility to avoid all of this. And he hadn't used it. This was Ino's mission all over again. He stepped through the dirty back alleys and the small and unkempt gutter roads that passed across the entirety of Konoha, ignoring the rooftops entirely. He didn't feel like walking beneath the sun. He didn't feel like looking to the sky. His mood was literally at the bottom of the ladder. He came out of a dirty side street just in time to see a woman, a Chiryunin judging by the flak jacket, enter through the doors of Root. He stilled for a second, not wishing to worry Danzo more about his troubles. He remained there for a while longer, hoping the woman would actually step outside. When that didn't happen, he nearly turned to leave. He gritted his teeth in frustration at the idea of going back to Danzo's house without even passing by to tell the old shinobi he had returned safely. He breathed in and out deeply, before finally taking the few steps that separated him from entering the shop. The moment he was inside, his nose twitched slightly. He recognized that smell. The coppery scent of blood, thick and salivating. He licked his lips slightly as he watched Danzo standing behind the counter, his only eye settled on him. He could smell the blood, but he actually couldn't see it. There was no body furthermore, so he supposed it could be a kin of dried meat somewhere? No, dried meat was bloodless. Maybe the contents of a blood-replenishing pill? That too made no sense. It wasn't as if there actually was blood in those. Naruto, Danzo nodded his head slightly, a small smile on his face. You came back already? Naruto just nodded slowly. I heard there was some trouble at the gates earlier. Was your team involved? Sheepishly, he scratched the back of his head before nodding once more. Yes, Shimura-sensei, he muttered. The target we had to bring back to Konoha, he went mad, Naruto whispered. We lost Aoba-sensei too, he grimaced as those words left his lips. And his shoulders began to tremble, as his vision clouded. Tears were streaking down his face as he looked at the floor, the cracked tiles and the polished pavement. He didn't see Danzo move, but he knew the next moment he was pulled into an awkward one-armed hug by the old shinobi. "Hush," Danzo whispered soothingly. "It's fine to cry. There is no one else here." "And Naruto?" Naruto cried. "It's not fair," he exclaimed between sniffles and sobs, holding onto the fabric of Danzo's black clothes. "It's not right. He shouldn't have died." Tears fell down copiously, as the dam was broken and Naruto sobbed his sadness, his grief, and his emotions out. He poured all that he felt outside through tears, and by the time he stopped a handkerchief was already there to wipe away the snot from his nose and the puffy red eyes. "It never is," Danzo answered slowly and calmly. "Death never is fair, Naruto. It comes when you least expect it and strikes against the people you would least likely think." Naruto nodded quietly. "I couldn't do anything, the enemy, they ambushed us. We could only run." "You know," Danzo remarked, "running isn't something bad, Naruto," the bandaged shinobi spoke. "Shinobi should not lay down their lives needlessly when not asked. A mission should be completed, but not at the cost of oneself." The Yami of shinobi actually kept his facade collected as he spoke something that went directly against his beliefs. "The code should be lax in its interpretation," he added then. He felt like committing seppuku. But when the boy looked at him with trust shining behind those teary eyes, how could he not say that? How could he not say the words he knew the boy wanted to hear? "We will be getting a new sensei soon," Naruto muttered. "I hope he will a good one." Danzo just nodded back thoughtfully. At the same time, in the Hokage Tower, the Sandaime was appointing his stamp. "No," he said for the last time. "You will not get Team 13. But." Kakashi's arms flailed wildly. "My team is recouping at the hospital." "Yes," Hiruzen narrowed his eyes. "And because of that I am wary of giving you another team who will probably end up in the same way before the exam starts." "Hokage-sama," Kakashi remarked. "I have to do this for the Yondaime, please." "No," Hiruzen shook his head firmly. "The new sensei has already been chosen. You will stand watch over Chiryunin Tsubaki and the team composed of Kabuto Yakushi, Yoroi Akado, and Misumi Tsurugi. If they meet again, you are to listen into their conversations and deliver them back to me." Deflated, Kakashi nodded quietly. "Who will you assign then?" the silver-haired Jounin remarked. "Tenzo." "No," Hiruzen replied. "Assigning him would be as good as confirming to Orochimaru that we know what his plans are for Konoha. He will furthermore know the skill set of the operative. I will assign Nico to the operation. She is a sensor type, with basic knowledge of Fuinjutsu." Kakashi didn't capitulate on the slipped edition of the Hokage, because he knew the Sandaime would actually tell him if he just glared at him with his only eye. "I think it's time Naruto learned the basics of sealing, don't you think? And if they will have to train harder than ever for the Chiryunin exams, then there will be no need for Danzo's intermissions. Nico is a skilled Kenjutsu fighter, not a Tanto user. I could train Naruto with the Tanto, if Danzo is the problem." Kakashi slowly tried again. "Kakashi," Hiruzen sighed. "You think I cannot understand what your thoughts are? This is a trap we are sending the kids into, Hokage-sama." The silver-haired Jounin exclaimed. "We know Orochimaru will strike during the exams, and he will strike at Naruto, to unleash the Kyuubi. And when he will try to do that, you will have already given me the means to intercept him and to take him down," Hiruzen answered coolly. "Do not let emotions cloud your judgment, Hatake. This is for the good of the village." Kakashi breathed and exhaled slowly. "I understand. Good, you are dismissed." Kakashi disappeared in a flicker, leaving behind a bundle of leaves that swept through the Sandaime's office and scattered his papers, the paperwork he had on the desk completely dispersing. Hiruzen looked for a second at the carnage of flying papers. "That," he muttered, biting hard on his pipe. "Ah." He sighed. "I'll go take a walk." Aoba-sensei's funeral was held 2 days later. Konoha's cemetery wasn't filled with more than half a dozen of persons. One old lady was crying, probably Yamashiro's mother. Naruto watched the scene with the most impassive face he could muster, standing on a nearby branch and away from the mass of black-dressed persons. He hated funerals. His left cheek hurt by impulse, rather than because someone had struck it. He didn't know if he'd be considered guilty of this too by the grieving mother, and he didn't want excuses anyway later on. He was tired of excuses. He could see Sakura every now and then look around, trying to find him. Sai knew where he was of course, but he hadn't told. The Hokage finished his funerary speech and then bowed politely to Aoba's mother, before leaving for the tower. It was an honor to have the Hokage personally talk at your funeral, and it was something only Jounins and Umbus received. Great honor indeed, for someone buried beneath the ground. He heard a soft step next to him, and the single gaze he sent in that direction told him all he needed to know. An Umbu wouldn't have made a soft step hearable unless they had wanted to announce themselves. A woman with long purple hair and a cat mask looked at him carefully. "You're not going down there. And you?" He rebuffed her in a low voice. "You have nothing else to do." She didn't reply. She just turned her gaze back to the line of people going to offer their condolences to the mother of Aoba. "Words are meaningless, right?" the woman suddenly said, startling Naruto out of his transfixion on the line moving. Words are meaningless. Is that why you are not down there? Because words won't change anything. He looked at the masked operative for a moment, before slowly nodding once. "It's not like he'll rise from his grave, it's empty to begin with," Naruto muttered. "And his body wasn't found, maybe." "That is fool's hope," the operative remarked. "Missing in action is just a fancy term. Don't hope on seeing him again." He gritted his teeth. "You knew Aoba-sensei?" he asked then, looking at the operative's striking figure up and down. She had a sword strapped to her back, a set of pouches and the Konoha symbol on her left shoulder. The uniform she was wearing was sleeveless, but she did have metal arm guards. "Not personally, no," the woman shook her head. Her brown eyes lingered over his face for a moment, before adding, "But I heard of him." "So, why are you here?" he asked then quietly. "We should do the presentations with the entire team present," she said, her gaze returning to the leaving crowd of black-dressed persons. "Ah," Naruto's eyes widened briefly for an instant. "You're our new sensei." Yojao blinked once. "You don't seem too surprised." "I am an Umbu. And I am the Jinhuriki of the Kyuubi," Naruto muttered back. "You think I haven't seen many of you casually strolling by my apartment, day and night?" "They aren't doing a good job if a genin can see them," Yojao muttered back. "I didn't," Naruto acquiesced. "Thanks for confirming it for me, though." The Umbu blinked, albeit through the mask Naruto couldn't see it. "Is this hazing?" she asked unceremoniously. "Are you trying something?" "The Chunin exams are soon," Naruto muttered back. "We intend on participating," he added then calmly. "Will that be a problem?" "I don't even know what your team can really do, past the reports and the evaluations your sensei wrote of," the Umbu answered carefully. "And unless I give my endorsement, you will not be participating." "Then you see," Naruto whispered. "We don't have a problem, we want to participate." "If you weren't, there would be a problem?" she asked then, slightly amused. "No," Naruto sighed. "Aoba-sensei wouldn't want us to give you trouble, but I'm sure Sakura would sulk and Sai would simply increase the number of caustic remarks." "Oh, right," Naruto blinked. "Sai's not a bad kid. He tends to speak his mind freely and is a bit strange most of the time, but I think he's just shy. If he gives you an ugly nickname it's not like he really means it." Yojao remained quiet, but she did nod once to indicate she was listening. "Sakura is our team leader," Naruto said once more. "She's the most people person there is between us, and she's got a book-smart mind when she's not scared. She's the one with the least stamina of us all, but she's training hard to overcome that." "And what about you?" Yojao asked once more. "I'm the Jinhuriki of the Kyuubi," he offhandedly remarked. "As long as I don't die in battle, I'll be up and about in 5 minutes. Wounds just don't stick with me." I'm learning Tanto Jitsu with a private teacher, Shimura-sensei, and... The boy sighed once, his eyes clouding. Well, I'm completely taijutsu-less. Something comes close to me and I'm dead if I'm unarmed and the enemy is skilled. His voice was barely a whisper, by the time he finally added. I already killed someone too, he shook his head. Understood, Yojeo nodded once. Let's go down now and pay our respects. The moment they descended from the branch, only Naruto's teammates had remained in the cemetery. Sakura huffed and clenched her right hand in a fist at the sight of him, but then simply shook her head and moved closer. She gave him an awkward hug, and then pushed him forward to the tombstone of their sensei. She did give a quizzical look to the Umbu, while Sai simply stared with his usual emotionless face. Nah, sensei, Naruto muttered to the tombstone. Hope you, His throat itched. Well, it's been an honor. He bowed deeply to the stone. I'll never forget you. And then Naruto stiffly turned around, and walked away. He walked back to the new sensei, who was an Umbu. He walked back to his teammates, who were there and like him had their heart torn apart. At least, he didn't know about Sai, but with Sai you never knew. My name, the Umbu began, is Yojeo Izuki. She removed her cat mask. She revealed her brown eyes and porcelain-like features to her team, before remarking. I am a member of the Ansatsu Senjutsu Takushu Butai, the Special Assassination and Tactical Squad. She shook her head. To be more correct, I was a member of the Umbu. As of now I have left the Corps and am reinstated as a Jounin, Ninja ID 012161. I like to train and have regular spars. My hobby is moon viewing and I dislike traitors to Konoha and the Hokage. My dream is to have a happy family life. She inclined her head towards Naruto. I'm sure you are all familiar with the presentations, Uzumaki. My name is Naruto Uzumaki. Without skipping a beat, Naruto began to talk. I like my team, he said then, and dislike those who would harm my team. That part came out as a slight growl. I enjoy the time spent training. I dream of becoming strong enough to protect my team. I know of a fellow shinobi who is pretty much identical in his mindset as you are, Yojeo remarked. A certain silver-haired shinobi sneezed, forcing him to drop the apple he had been peeling and to start again. Sasuke bandaged and with his limbs in casts looked at him with murderous intent and a clear-cut desire to hurt the Jounin. Harano. Yojeo quipped then, looking at the pink-haired girl who had a slight blush on her face. My name is Sakura Harano, she stammered out first, before regaining her cool. I like my team, she said then, a strange smile settling on her face. And I dislike those who would harm my team. The smile turned positively feral by then as Yojeo began to groan mentally. I enjoy the time spent training. I dream of becoming strong enough to protect my team. Sato. Yojeo turned to the pale-skinned boy, who frowned for just a second. I am Sai Sato. I like drawing, Cherry and Dickless. Yojeo actually blinked, before turning to both Naruto and Sakura who just shrugged back. I dislike seeing them hurt. There was a sort of gagging noise from Yojeo's back mind. And I. He seemed to struggle for a moment, before finally adding with a small smile on his lips. I like being in this team, he whispered. And I dream of becoming strong enough to protect my team. You planned this, Yojeo finally said, turning her gaze to where Naruto was who simply smiled back with a wide grin. There won't be any problems, sensei, Naruto remarked. I told you that. If Yojeo didn't die from the excess sappiness in their words, then probably there wouldn't be. She sighed, shaking her head slightly. How about we go somewhere for lunch? We can get to know each other better than this in that way. The trio nodded at the same time. Yojeo groaned again. Chapter 19, The Hook Without Sinker. Training Ground 29 was a square of concrete, settled within an outcrop of bamboo canes and steel wires. Usually, the training ground was reserved for in-street fighting. It also was her favorite training spot, as it couldn't be easily accessed and from the outside people couldn't see within. Her team was looking at each other, rather than at her. She supposed it was the norm in any group. She had never taught before, but with the need to leave the Umbu since she had all the intentions of getting married, there simply was no other way. Sure, she could have simply remained a Jounin, but this was also another way of training for motherhood. How difficult would it be to take care of 3 students? She looked at the 3 of them standing tightly knit together. Probably the team training would be unnecessary, but she had to make sure. Well, she began, coughing slightly to get their attention. Her brown eyes schemed briefly over their choice of attire, but said nothing more. The girl, Sakura, was wearing a green jacket with a black shirt, a symbol of Konoha in red etched on the front. She was wearing a pair of beige shorts, and had ankle-length sandals. Sai was instead still dressed in his usual all-black attire, but he was sporting 2 tanto strapped to his back rather than 1. Naruto was wearing his hair raven and spiky, the Konoha forehead protector knotted on his right shoulder. He had a dark brown jacket, whose inner seams were all red. His shirt was a dark blue navy color, while his trousers were a really dark crimson. So dark it actually looked more like brown than crimson. He was wearing black sandals. I would like to test your prowess in battle, she began carefully. Do you prefer one-on-one or team? She was surprised when the gaze of the trio didn't fall on Sakura, who was the team leader, but on Naruto. She slightly raised an eyebrow, but decided to ask the question later on. One-on-one, Naruto answered back calmly. She frowned. She had expected them to answer with team because of their closeness, but if that was how they wanted to play it. Fine, she pointed at Sakura. You first then, she smirked slightly. Cherry. Sakura hesitantly walked forward, her right hand resting on her hip as she slowly went with her left to her pouch. Yojao frowned once more. How could she be that slow in drawing shurikens? There was a standard at the academy for that, wasn't there? She was trying her best to conceal the shurikens though, that much she had to admit. Her right hand now palming a kunai, she waited for her signal to start. The moment Yojao took position and nodded, the kunai flew straight for her in a direct line trajectory. She huffed as she simply swatted away the slow-traveling kunai for her senses, at least before silently skirting around the flying shurikens and avoiding them. The girl hadn't been moving much except for taking out kunai or throwing shurikens. The Umbu closed the distance between them in a flash, ready to slam a fist straight into the girl's guts. The sound of hurried footsteps forced Yojao to sidestep to the side once, and avoid an incoming steel point of a tanto, before immediately having to jump back to avoid 3 slithering black ink snakes that had tried to attack her then. She was about to say something, but her mouth stopped at the narrowed gaze of those cold and icy cerulean orbs who were still charging forward, tanto in hand. She recognized those eyes. The will to murder was something operatives were taught once in Umbu, however, not something a genin was supposed to know. It wasn't a technique per se, so it wasn't as if someone had gone against the law. Simply, there was a difference between charging in with the intent to wound, or because one was scared, and charging in fully prepared to kill or be killed. She knew Heitake used to say, "Come at me with the intent to kill," every time he trained his students, but nobody had ever understood what he meant. She flexed her toes slightly and jumped in midair, before disappearing in a flash of leaves. She watched from the shadows of the bamboo canes the trio stand shoulder to shoulder, the 2 boys with a tanto and the girl with a kunai. She wasn't going to call fool. Seriously, they had done beyond expectations. She was just going to toy with them for a moment. She grabbed 3 shurikens, and with precise and fluid motions launched them from her hiding spot before moving once more. C6. Sakura exclaimed, dashing back as the 2 boys charged ahead in 2 different positions. Yojao frowned. C6. She watched as Sai disappeared in the bamboo cane patch behind her, while Naruto instead ended up somewhere in front of her. Sakura remained alone in the center. Were they using the girl as bait? No, there was a slight shimmer on the ground next to the girl. It was the ear-ank technique, the one that required a small amount of chakra pooled into a cloak to hide with the terrain. So the girl near it was just an illusion. She jumped out of the bamboo cane patch anyway, especially when the slicing noise reached her ears. Since when did they give giant shurikens to genins? Another one had been thrown from the opposite direction. Of course, they had no idea where she was, and they knew better than to try and fight her head-on. They could lucky guess though. She slammed her right foot against the illusion-covered cloak, expecting to see a terrified genin beneath it. She found a trove of dark inky snakes ready to bite her. A volley of shurikens hastily drawn and thrown destroyed them, but she had to admit, once more, that they were going beyond expectations. She scoffed. How was she going to compete with Aoba's own teachings, if these were his results? She watched with vivid interest as nigh invisible wire fell in wide circles over the training ground. They were probably setting off a trap of sorts with launchers. How were they going to let it start without attracting attention? An ink lion roared loudly as it charged from the corner of her eyesight. The teeth were dangerous, but the tail, was that the tail of a snake to begin with? She simply recoiled slightly, before punching straight to the side the ink creature. The flash of steel of a chakra-enhanced Tonto forced her to rely on her instincts, as she grabbed the wrist that popped from the ink and with a sudden jerking motion snapped it cleanly, before throwing the genin on the ground. In her defense, she hadn't expected it. On the plus side, Naruto didn't scream. As she let him go, he just jumped out of the way and back in the bamboo patch. Maybe it was time she called the exercise done. She had seen enough, hadn't she? But it was fun. On Umbu missions one rarely had the time to toy with opponents. They always were adrenaline-induced high-risk missions from which there was little chance of survival for anyone else, and the mortality rate of operatives was usually of 50%. So, in this occasion, she was having fun and there was nothing the three genin could do to actually hurt her. It was a nice change of pace. She'd probably have to buy lunch for the trio of course, and maybe even dinner for Naruto, but everything was otherwise extremely enjoyable. Her ears heard the soft muffled cry and the slight snapping of bones once more. Had the boy settled his own wrist? It took guts. Well, she had let him go. If she had simply completed the motion with the kunao in her other hand, she could have killed him already. The trap was probably ready, because in the middle of the steel wires it was Sai who appeared next. She cocked her head to the side with a small grin on her face, and then she kicked the concrete ground once before slowly taking out her own sword. It was an open space. Katanas were a must. Maybe between the bamboo crops and the random steel wires Tontos were more useful, but in the center of the concrete circle, she charged ahead, quietly making a cage bunshin to finish the move while she simply hid once more in the canes. Sai didn't dodge, but then again he didn't need to since it merely was an ink clone who fell on the ground in a puddle of black liquid. The wires snapped around her cage bunshin, before a volley of shurikens, kunaos, and even needles barraged the area. She could have probably snapped the wires with ease and escaped, but a Chiryunin would most certainly have to sweat his way through it. If not outright die. All right, she exclaimed then, emerging from her hiding spot. Exercise is over. Come on out. 3 seconds later and the three genin were in front of her. Sweaty, grime-filled for some reason and the girl reeking of oil, but none worse for the wear. Naruto's wrist was enclosed with bamboo canes and steel wire, and it had apparently been tightened firmly. You all did well, she announced proudly. I have some questions however, she turned to Sakura. You're the team leader, why were you and Sai taking orders from Naruto? Well, Sakura remarked. He's the field leader. I'm the people person, he's the wicked one. Yojao nodded. Generally the field leader was used only in groups of 7 or more shinobi, where a spot to coordinate more than one team was required. What exactly does C6 mean? Yojao asked then. I suppose it's a plan of battle already pre-planned. Contingency crap 6, Sakura muttered in a low voice. Aoba-sensei had contingencies from Alpha to Omega, and then he had the crap 10. When one of those happens the purpose is to survive rather than to fight. And an Umbu is at crap 6. Yojao remarked calmly. She wasn't surprised by the vulgar word used. Heck if she didn't know just what the Umbu used for Fubar. Umbu figure wanting your guts is at crap 6, Naruto nodded sagely. Crap 7 is Umbu Teiku. Crap 8 is S rank. Crap 9 is a cage and crap 10 is an entire shinobi village out to get you. Aoba-sensei used to say that if you reached crap 9 then you were clearly doing something wrong with the act discreetly part of being a shinobi, Sakura remarked. I see, Yojao commented. How were you communicating one with the other? I didn't hear radio chatter. Sai slowly took out a scroll and drew a line upon it, before calling forth an ink needle. Yojao watched as the boy flicked it straight against Naruto, where it impacted and slowly slithered its way to his forearm. There it became kanji. Long distance and pincer. I see, the purple-haired woman remarked. But how did they answer back? Naruto tapped twice on the words, as a small spike of chakra filled them and reformed them. Affirmative. The next moment it condensed once more into a chakra needle, and Naruto threw it back at Sai, who acquired the same words. It requires chakra control and a good aim, Sakura commented then, but it was the best we could come up with that didn't require sound, and we're still working on silent hand signs. I see, the Jounin crossed her arms over her chest, taking in and pondering over what to do. Well, I suppose we can go to the hospital for Naruto's injury, and then. That won't be needed, sensei. The wrist was unbound with Naruto's words, and instead of a heavily red or broken limb stood a freshly unscathed one. It was as if she had never broken it to begin with. Oh, right, Yojeo blinked once. You did tell me about this, didn't you? Yes, I did, he replied coldly. There was silence for a moment more, before Yojeo exhaled slowly. It wasn't on purpose, she remarked calmly. You were good, and I acted on instincts. This should say a lot about your team. I didn't specifically manhandle you, there, she saw it. The glint in the back of his eyes. It was either distrust or reluctant acceptance, but anyway she had taken it out in the bud. It would be a long way before any of them would trust her like they did their sensei, but maybe she could fast-track them into Umbu eventually. The thought of being able to brag about her entire team entering Umbu wasn't so bad, at least in her mind. Well, with what I saw there is no doubt you are all ready for the Churyunin exams, she nodded sagely. Let's move to another training ground, this is ill-suited for general stamina building. She turned thoughtful for a second more, training ground 7 should be free. You go ahead, I'll put things back as they were here. The trio nodded and began to walk away, leaving her there. She turned her gaze sideways, diagonally upwards. When the 3 genin were finally out of sight, she exhaled slowly. Hey Take-san, you can come out. A tuft of silver hair accompanied by a mask-wearing man appeared right next to her. Oh, Ma. You found me. The orange-covered book of Ika Ika Lusty team building in his hands, he smiled with his only available eye. You were watching since the beginning, right? She asked then, accusingly. I was just lost on the road of life, he remarked. And I stumbled upon this area by chance. Yojeo's sweat dropped slightly. Really? She turned thoughtful. Hey Take-san, you don't want them to participate in the exams. It was the only reason she could think of for having been able to sense him. Unless the wolf-masked Umbu had gone soft over the years, she knew it had been her mentioning of the Churyunin exams to the genin that had brought him out. Ma. Why would I do that? Kakashi replied. Just, train them well, yes. He winked with his only eye. They're pretty special. We don't want them hurt. She raised her right eyebrow. It's about Uzumaki, isn't it? He is a little bit more special than the others, but you should value the team in its entirety. I'm not blind, she remarked. The Hokage told me of his parentage. Good, then you know why. Still, Yojeo mumbled. He should at least be granted. I wouldn't go there, Kakashi's tone turned slightly frosty. If there is something worse than going to a tomb every day, it's to know that the grave is empty. Maybe you're right, senpai, Yojeo muttered. She turned thoughtful for a second. Did you see his eyes? Oh no, Tsunade. Don't stiffen poor Jiraiya like that without lubricating. Yojeo glared at Kakashi. Kakashi ignored the heated glare. The purple-haired Kunoichi groaned. Fine, but it's my team now, hey Take-san. Please don't try and meddle with them. Don't you have your own team to talk with? They won't be in the exams, Kakashi said. Unfortunate training accident. The silver-haired shinobi closed the book then, before adding, I think I should go. Even fashionably late can run out of fashion eventually. Yojeo didn't even bother to look startled as the man disappeared quickly, leaving her alone in the training ground which didn't need to be repaired, since it was a duty some Churyunin would take on them eventually. She jumped away to the training ground where she had gestured her team to go her objective. She supposed they could eat somewhere nice for lunch, then they could take a D-rank mission for the afternoon. Something easy, without too much trouble. The easy and not troubling mission they signed for, during the afternoon, was nothing short of the most boring thing ever to be done in the history of Konohagaku no Sato. They had to set the library records in the Konoha Public Archives back to their alphabetical order. The work was done in a dusty and mold-filled place whose stale air contrasted sharply with the humidity of the walls themselves. The metal drawers glinted painfully against the light that shone from the ceiling, and if the sharp contrast wasn't enough, many of the corridors within the place were unlit and dropped in pitch-black darkness. They had strict orders not to read anything within, but then again all documents had to be waxed if found open. Sakura came to the waxing desk with a pile of unfolded documents, which Sai neatly began to seal once more using a stamp. Their sensei was watching from a corner, her face scrunched in concentration. The job was being done dutifully and without a moment of complaint, but at the same time the eerie quiet atmosphere was unnerving her. There existed a thing known as too quiet after all. Naruto was looking through another pile of wax-filled envelopes, trying to find their position in the archives, when a picture hastily dropped on a nearby pile caught his attention. He raised an eyebrow as he moved closer to it. The picture was of a jounin with bright red hair that fell behind her shoulders, with violet eyes and a bright grin on her face. She was making the victory sign too. He turned the picture trying to find some sort of indication of where it belonged, but all he got was a hastily scribbled UK Jounin promotion. He looked around, for the U archive. Looking at the folders on the table, his gaze lingered for a moment back on the corridor from which he had come through. His sensei wasn't within sight, and since his job was to settle the archives back to order, Naruto kind of had to open the folders. At least to look for a UK of sorts. Utsumi Kazuko wasn't clearly the woman in the picture, since he was a male. Urara Katsu wasn't either. His gaze settled on the last folder of the pile. Red hair, violet eyes, height, weight, Uzumaki Kushina. His hands felt numb as his eyes began to descend over the data. From the ninja registration ID to the age of service, he began to carefully and calmly read everything. There was no mention of marriage. She resulted dead from the Kuwabai attack. There was a big black redacted written over the reason for her leaving the active shinobi corps, but except for that, it looked like a normal folder to him, if it weren't for the fact that his father's word rung through his head in that precise moment. And tell Kakashi that if Kushina could see him, he'd kill him for having dropped off the radar with you. It was then that his gaze settled on her team's composition. Team 12, Uzumaki Kushina. Jounin Sensei, Orochimaru. His breathing hitched. The folder fell on the table. He gasped as he heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, he closed the folder. He feigned indifference as best as he could as he began to work the pile as if everything was normal. Everything all right, Naruto? His sensei's voice reached and startled him. Ah. Yes, he nodded quickly. I was just looking where this pile had to go. Why was he acting like that to begin with? Orochimaru was just the name of the traitor of the leaf. The S-rank missing nin who had single-handedly managed to defeat both the Hokage and his teammates while making his own escape. He was the boogeyman of kids. You wanted to scare a child? You just had to tell them Orochimaru was out to get them. The purple-haired woman was of course suspicious, her eyes narrowing slightly told him that much. You looked at any of these? She asked then lightly. And no, he stammered out shaking his head. It's just that, they shouldn't be here. The U archive in on the other side, right? The Umbu raised an eyebrow at that, before carefully moving to the first folder of the pile. She frowned. Yes, it isn't normal. They shouldn't actually be here. I'll take care of moving these, she remarked. Nice catch. Look around if you find any more, Naruto. Why yeah. He nodded firmly, before turning to his task once more. He mentally scoffed as he began to recall the entire conversation. He really was a smooth shinobi, wasn't he? He couldn't even lie to save his life. Not that it mattered much after all, he was just curious about a potential family member who had died. That was all. It was only when he finally calmed enough to start looking at his surroundings that he realized he had been holding onto the picture of the woman. He hissed in surprise, before quickly placing it in the inner pockets of his jacket. He was going to drop it off on another day, of course. As it turned out, he completely forgot about the picture of his mother until he sat down to eat dinner, later that same day, with Danzo-sensei. "How has your day been?" the old shinobi asked calmly, his only eye fixed on him. "The new sensei is Numbu," he muttered back. "We went to clean the archives today." "Oh? Read anything interesting?" How? What? "No, of course not. When I was your age I always did give a quick peek to the folders that had my same surname," Danzo said. "I was an orphan, you know. I never found a connection, but then again." The old shinobi sighed. There wasn't much to hope. Konoha was just budding, and already wars loomed over its future. "Danzo-sensei," Naruto bit his lower lip. "What were the Hokage like? What brings this on?" "The Sandaime, he spoke of how the Hokage should put the village before the single shinobi. I wondered what the other Hokage were like because of this." Danzo closed his only eye for a moment, as if lost in thought. "The first Hokage, he always had a smile on his face and a sunny disposition. He used to say that heaven's garments were without seams, meaning that the simple things were the most beautiful." The old shinobi chuckled slightly. "He was the reason Konoha held so many different clans that coexisted peacefully." Carefully, Danzo lowered his chopsticks. Tobirama-sensei instead was more pragmatic. He firmly believed in laws, placing them before the person. He was colder than his older brother, but also more logical. "You can never fully trust someone, unless you hold their hearts in your hand," he commented. The Yami of Shinobi remained quiet for a moment more, before he finally added. "However, they both valued the village before the individual, but you must understand, Naruto, that they valued the shinobi as well. They never asked for something they themselves were not ready to give. The second Hokage sacrificed himself to save his team from the Kinkaku force, knowing fully well he would not escape acting as a diversion. The first Hokage battled against Madara and all of the Bijos, defeating and imprisoning them." Naruto's eyes widened at the implication. "He was that strong?" "Indeed," Danzo nodded firmly. "He came from an era of war, one among many brothers, but war always have a way to take the things you cherish away," the old shinobi quipped. "That is why when wars are fought they must be fought with no moderation. They must be fought completely, utterly, with full conviction and no space of error or lapse of judgment. To wait and see is to stall, and to stall is to have the number of victims rise day by day, hour by hour." "Danzo-sensei," Naruto began then hesitantly. "What about the heroes of the war? The three Sunin? Do they place the village before?" "No," Danzo interrupted brusquely, his tone turning slightly frosty. "This is a lesson that must be learned well when you will have students, Naruto. Power begets freedom and corruption in equal amount. The more powerful someone is, the freer he turns out to be, and at the same time laws start to make less sense on him too. Tsunade Senju, heir of the noble clan Senju, is an indebted alcoholic who spends her time dallying around the country without a purpose, if not racking up even more debt. The Sandaime cannot recall her back because she refuses to be found, and the only one who could find her fakes trails to reach dead ends." There was now a low grumble in Danzo's throat. "The second one, Jiraiya, is an author of perverted debauchery who holds a spy network so laxly that it's a wonder it is still active. He refuses to choose an heir to his techniques, and has already renounced the Konoha Forehead Protector for that of the Mount of Toads, effectively making him loyal only in name to the village itself." The scowl now reached full force. "And finally there is the outright traitor of the leaf, Orochimaru. He was the brightest of the three, the most cunning. I personally taught him too, you know. I was the one who placed him in Umbu, and that was probably his downfall. He no longer answered to me, but only to the Hokage, and Hiruzen was too soft. He didn't see the signs. In war, Orochimaru's experiments were needed. He was the one who co-engineered half of the medical pills we use, and quite a few summoning contracts entered our village because of him. Yet for all his worth, in the end he tasted the full power of being free of restrictions, and the laws of Konoha seemed like tight chains and shackle to him thereafter." Danzo shook his head. "He betrayed the village not before sacrificing his own students for one more gruesome experiment and left after having battled to a standstill Hiruzen and, later on, Jiraiya." The old shinobi clenched his left hand slightly. There is no greater enemy than him for the well-being of Konoha. And he is after me? Naruto's throat clenched slightly. He wants to kill me? Probably not, Danzo replied. He always had a fascination with the Uzumaki. He had a student which was one, if I recall correctly. Why? Who knows, Danzo shrugged slightly. Probably, he was curious about the rumored long life and vitality of the clan. He became engrossed with immortality in the end, and that was probably his downfall. He made mistakes, corpses not properly treated which left small trails that the Umbu in the end managed to follow. His laboratories were found and dismantled afterwards. How did the Kyuubi break free? Naruto's eyes widened suddenly. Danzo smiled. The smile was positively feral. The previous container failed to keep the beast in check while giving birth. His tone turned thoughtful. Albeit many say that having told her sensei, Orochimaru himself had a part in it, but there was no proof against him of course. Kushina Uzumaki, his mother, would never have unleashed the Kyuubi willingly. There were only a few people who could actually answer what had happened that night, and one was all but trustworthy. The Kyuubi was then sealed in me, he remarked carefully. Was she, my mother? That is an S-rank secret, Danzo replied. Are you my mother? Naruto asked back calmly, his eyes narrowing on the old shinobi who looked back at him perplexed for a second, before a grin rose on his lips. No, I am not. So she was my mother, the genin exhaled a breath he hadn't known to be holding inside of him. And she died that night, when the Kyuubi escaped from her. That is an S-rank secret, Danzo remarked once more. Naruto's face furrowed in confusion. My mother died, right? That is an S-rank secret. Naruto dropped his chopsticks. He watched with his eyes bugging out the Yami of Shinobi, who merely looked back at him with a slightly grieving face. His voice was barely a croaked whisper when he spoke. Why wasn't I told? Because, Danzo said then, there is nothing you could do. Where is she? That is an S-rank secret. IWA. No, Danzo scoffed. Where do you think a wounded person would go after a battle? Hospital, Naruto answered then. She's in the hospital of Konoha. He mentally cursed. He had been in that hospital practically every week. He was supposed to have caught on to it eventually. That is an S-rank secret, Danzo nodded thoughtfully. Before we proceed in this game of false or S-rank secret, I must warn you, Naruto, his sensei's voice was thick with seriousness, you will not like what you will find, if you decide to pursue this. Naruto breathed once more. He closed his eyes. Could he trust his sensei's words? If he didn't, whose words could he trust? The Kyuubi, he wasn't even talking. He supposed the fox was sitting there somewhere, playing shogi or solitaire while smirking. Yes, he could even imagine the nine-tailed demon simply smirking no matter what he chose. He hadn't trusted the Kyuubi the first time, and he had paid the consequences. If he didn't trust his sensei now. All right, Naruto muttered. I'll think about it. Danzo smiled. Thank you for your trust, Naruto, he began to say, you did the right thing. It pains me to force you like this but... The Yami shook his head firmly. Let us talk about the incoming Chunin exams then, the retired shinobi asked. Are you and your team ready? Naruto felt slightly hollow as he nodded and began making small talk. He was a coward. He should have asked. Now he'd have to find out on his own. Yojao Izuki was washing the dishes helped by Hayate, her boyfriend, when the man's rough voice reached her ears. I was chosen to be the proctor for the third part of the exam, he remarked. Is your team going to participate? Yojao answered back with a slightly sheepish tone. She had trained herself for a long while to manage it. Yes. You don't need to fake the tone, Hayate sighed, before coughing slightly, bringing his right hand to his mouth. You'll get there, eventually. I hope so, Yojao's voice was stern once more. It's just, why did they choose you? You know, with my lungs as they are, Hayate said, strenuous activity is out. I'm usually doing counterintelligence within Konoha, and since they did need a proctor. Who did they choose for the first and second parts? Ibiki's doing the first, and Anko is doing the second, he replied, slowly sliding the dishes into the cupboard. So, you're planning on sending the rookies out? They aren't rookies, she replied, shaking her head. They're solid, all of them. Sai and Naruto are clear-cut Chiyunins already. It's a shame Naruto doesn't have any techniques, but I can understand the thought. With the amount of chakra he has, Hayate shuddered. So, how are they going to enter the fray? Assassination squad, she replied calmly. All three of them. The girl's a trap maker. Sai is the recon and Naruto is the strategist. You know, Hayate slowly scratched the tip of his nose. I'll have to tell them I can't be the proctor if your team is up for running. There's a conflict of interests and whatnot. Understood, Yojao nodded firmly. She looked outside the nearby window. It's time for your medicine, Hayate. Ah, yes, Hayate frowned. I'm going. He began to move, slowly making his way towards the bathroom. Yojao remained alone, staring at the dish she was washing. She knew of at least 10 ways of killing someone with broken or jagged ceramic edges. She knew of 5 ways to make the soap a lethal instrument. The running water could be the source of a water jutsu. If she wanted to kill Hayate, she would just need to swap his medication pills for poisoned ones. She knew it wasn't the right thing to do, thinking of all possible ways to kill someone. But she was Umbu, and that was what they expected from her. Was she really going back to the normal life of a shinobi? She couldn't believe it. She still waited with bated breath for a secret summon, telling her the deep cover was done and she could resume being cat. She could fake it really well, of course, but some emotions were more subtle to catch. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, and the cat-masked face looked back at her. You're not screwed up, Yojao firmly stated. You're just different. She just had to believe that. Yes, she just had to believe. Meanwhile, on a darkened rooftop near the hot springs of Konoha, a grim-looking white-haired man sighed. Damn, Jiraiya of the Densetsu-Sunin muttered. I arrived late. His shoulders dropped. The hot springs are closed, he whispered to himself. Damn. Chapter 20, The Meetings Among Equals. Jiraiya of the Sunin jumped from rooftop to rooftop, silently making his way through the village. He avoided both the Umbu patrols, which would have just wasted his time with identification procedures, and the possible civilian fans of his erotic words, which would simply create a fuss and stall him for autographs. It actually saddened him that people enjoyed porn more than other types of serious novels. All he had to do was to write in a perfectly readable way a few choice sentences like, luscious breasts with perky nipples or, smooth alabaster-like skin, and then rinse and repeat them. People were that dumb. He tugged at his wide jacket, taking out a scroll and an ink brush. Quickly dipping the brush in ink all the while running towards the Hokage Tower, he wrote a quick message. I'm in town, old geezer, see you soon. He slapped the message against the window of the tower with a powerful jump, before spinning in midair and using the momentum to land on the tower's roof. From there, another jump brought him all the way up to where the Hokage monument was. He narrowed his eyes as he took in the beauty of his village at night. He had arrived relatively late, meaning the lights of the Red District were still fully working, and the banter from that area as well as the restaurant one was still high. Food or women, he mused. The eternal dilemma. He watched with trepidation a few buxom ladies holding their merchandise out in the open and fresh air of the night within the Red District, his keen eyesight telling him all he needed to know about them. He grinned as a small dribble of blood fell down his nose. Landing squarely in front of the closest consolation bar, he smiled and opened his arms wide as he stepped inside. Who's ready for a party? The cheerful noise of girls coming his way was all the confirmation he needed. It was good to be home. He sat down loftily, a girl per arm and a third one serving him one of their most prized sake bottles. He laughed and took sips, enjoying both the music and the attention. He had money, and as long as he had, then there was nothing the girls wouldn't do for him. He had fame, and because of that he could stretch the line a bit more. He was a bloody war hero, and if he wanted to, he could outright snap the line and bring them all to bed. If he so wished, of course. He didn't. It was easy to see that there was no real enjoyment in the girls that surrounded him. They were just taking care of him because he was famous and had money, not because they sincerely enjoyed his company. He laughed harder as one of the girls came out with a joke, even if he thought it was tasteless. Anything to deaden the pain. It didn't take much for the women to leave, as the bright white robes of the Hokage had that effect on any whorehouse or house of pleasure in Konoha. Hiruzen looked at him slightly affronted, before gritting his teeth. "Jiraiya, my misguided student," the old man always began his greeting like that for him, "what are you doing here?" "Well, it was late, and I didn't want to interrupt your work." Actually, he just hadn't wanted to go on a long-winded report of what was transpiring soon enough, not without confirmation at least. "Nonsense," Hiruzen narrowed his eyes, taking a seat on an armchair opposite from him. "What news of IWA?" "They're sending a team," Jiraiya answered back. "They're sending a team with the Tsuchikage's granddaughter in it. Political backslash would be terrible should she die," Hiruzen muttered. "That old coot, he basically asks us to promote her or bring war." "It gets worse," the Sunin muttered. "I know from a source that they're scouting for the Jinhiriki of Konoha. When the wool we pulled over their eyes failed with Orochimaru." His voice turned sorrowful. "They're suspicious we don't actually have the Kyuubi in check." "There's more to it," the Sandaime said, shaking his head. "Isn't there?" "Yeah, they wouldn't normally be this forward about it, but rumor is both of their Jinhiriki have gone missing, and the blame is shifting over who is at fault," Jiraiya acquiesced. "They're sending them to scout, claim ignorance and have them shipped back if discovered." Hiruzen sighed. "I knew Unaki was a scoundrel, but to swoop so low as to use his own granddaughter? Every man should have an ethic at least." He shook his head. "There's more," Jiraiya licked his lips as he took a swig of sake. "A Megakuer is in shambles. Someone killed Hanzo and took his place, and guess what? There's no mention of it anywhere in the streets. Not a single whisper at all. You'd expect they'd be overjoyed or something, but it's like he never died in the first place. Hell, I didn't even actually see his body. Only, all his top-level guards suddenly dead and he is no longer leaving his rooms. He's dead." The Sandaime took out his pipe, slowly lighting it and taking a deep breath of tobacco from it. "Anything more to add, Jiraiya?" "There have been rumors," he fidgeted. Jiraiya never fidgeted unless it concerned someone very specific, and immediately Hiruzen narrowed his eyes. "That Tsunade was last seen with Orochimaru." The old shinobi exhaled, before turning an icy glare to his student. "Jiraiya." I know. The spy master brought up both hands. "You know, if my source weren't trusted, I would never even imply this," he added. "And you know how much I value Tsunade, sensei." "I know," Hiruzen nodded thoughtfully. "So, have you any solid proof? Any lead on a reason?" "No," the white-haired Sunin shook his head. "I don't, unless he managed to convince her because of what happened." The Sandaime grimaced, before taking a slow puff of smoke. As he exhaled the smoke, his gaze turned stern. "This time, try and contact her, Jiraiya. If Orochimaru gets his hands on her medical knowledge." "I understand, Hokage-sama," the white-haired man replied, his voice slightly heavy. Hiruzen smiled briefly, before nodding. "Well, enough of this. I didn't call you back only for your report." The old Hokage clasped his hands together, his expression turning thoughtful. "There is a problem with Naruto, Jiraiya." The other shinobi tensed. "What happened?" "Danzo," Hiruzen sighed, moving the pipe in his mouth from one side to the other. "He managed to sink his claws in him. He's fast-tracking him for Umbu." "He can't do that," Jiraiya muttered, before looking at his sensei. "You can't do that." "It will be out of my hands," the Sandaime remarked. "If it is of any consolation, none of the clans would want to hear about the Jinhiriki being the personal right hand of the Hokage, or some rubbish like that. It only makes things worse." The other shinobi shook his head. "Umbu changes people. Look what it did to Orochimaru. You can't fault the program because of one shinobi." "No, but I can fault you for not catching on him faster." The Toad Sennin hissed venomously. "You were supposed to be there." That was my fault," Hiruzen acquiesced. "But I didn't see it when I could, and then I was too busy trying to keep the village afloat to give it the time it required. And someone else was stupidly elsewhere, trying to forget about all of his duties." Do you know I came close to branding all 3 of my students as missing nin? Where were you, when the village needed it the most? Jiraiya averted his gaze. Living a dream, I suppose. There was an uncomfortable silence. But it doesn't matter, does it? What's done is done. Indeed, Hiruzen nodded. What matters now is what you will be doing with Naruto. I could take the squirt on as an apprentice. Show him the good life, Jiraiya smiled brightly. The light side, you know. Please avoid taking him to a whorehouse on his first training day, the Sandaime sighed. I still recall how twitchy your genin were the next month. Who does he take most from? Jiraiya asked then. Is he a mini Kushina or? He was, Hiruzen muttered. He was such a bright ray of light. The Sandaime's voice actually held a tone of sorrow as the shinobi spoke. And now there's just nothing. On one hand, I admire his desire to hold his emotions in check like a true shinobi, but on the other hand, I regret a child having to hide his hurt from the world. I couldn't take him in, sensei, Jiraiya whispered. I was always around, and me taking care of a baby? It's the beginning of a tragic comedy, and you know it. I wasn't faulting you, my student, Hiruzen said. Answering your question, I think a melancholic Minato would be the most apt description. However, you will have to fight for his trust. If you can't win him over, then you'll have to try with his team. They recently lost their sensei, and while I already gave them a replacement. So he trusts his teammates, Jiraiya quipped in. That's not a bad thing at all. I thought with Danzo he'd distrust everything and everyone. Don't remind me, Hiruzen whispered. I doubt he will ever trust me again. After his sensei died, I chose poorly with my words. I doubt he views me as more than a tyrant who ficklessly sacrifices his men. And aren't you one? Could have fooled me, Jiraiya sarcastically replied. He'll come to. He's a kid, they rebound from pretty much everything. He's as much of a kid as Orochimaru was, Hiruzen muttered. He already killed. He's already able to look at you and see a target, rather than just a person. Danzo trains him well, but if this keeps up there will no longer be a Naruto to train, but just a second copy of Yami. So I have to take him out, show him the fun of the world. No, the Sandaime shook his head. You're more likely to have him rebuff you that way. Take the no-nonsense approach. The one you used with Minato. He'll respond to that, but don't try and make him a second copy of your student Jiraiya, let him be his own person. And if his own person has an agenda against Konoha? One similar to Orochimaru, Danzo or whoever else. The Sandaime breathed deeply. He exhaled slowly a moment later. You are the one with the Fuinjutsu knowledge necessary to extract the Kyuubi. And in that single sentence, Jiraiya understood perfectly all the underlying messages sent his way. He's my godson. A godfather who is never there cannot claim to have one. They entrusted him to me, sensei. And you in turn left the village. I already said my piece about it. Jiraiya exclaimed. You can't fault me for that. The patrons of the pleasure house had been slowly creeping outside, one after the other. They left as silently as they could just in case they ended up eavesdropping upon hushed secrets that could mean their termination for the safety of the village. It was just as Jiraiya finished his rant that the last of the patron hurriedly paid and left. Except for the Umbu guards dressed as normal patrons, and the apparently new bartender who had begun his shift in that moment, there was no one else in the bar. No, but you cannot fault me for taking care of the village first, Jiraiya. Hiruzen hissed. I did what I could for him with what I could get away with. After the attack, Konoha had to remain united and the clans had to be pacified. Do you know they actually wanted the Kyuubi extracted from Naruto, a nameless orphan, to be placed in one of the clan heirs? Thankfully the seal could not be replicated, or you wouldn't have a godson to begin with. I know that, the Toad Sonin snarled back. I placed Konoha before him too, you know? I had to. You begged me to do what I could to keep the other villages away. You begged all of us. Tsunade had to heal Unaki's hip for Kami's sake to keep the old man out of the way. We all have our problems and our faults in this, Jiraiya, Hiruzen finished calmly. There isn't a single innocent soul around here, and we both know it. Yet I must ask you once more this. Please, For the good of Konoha, if it will come to it. Jiraiya exhaled. I will not kill my godson, unless he actually becomes a threat to Konoha's citizens. The man's eyes narrowed, and if it will come to that, I will not be coming back. The Sandaime exhaled. That is all I can ask of you. And it is all I will give. The next few days went by idly, as preparation for the Chunin exams within Konoha reached a new peak. Foreign diplomats and ambassadors began to arrive, soon followed by minor nobles from around the country of fire and the neighboring areas. Team 13 was locked in a grueling reflex training, with sharp-pointed steel shurikens flying at them from all sides of a thornbush-filled training ground. The thorns in the bushes had already reduced to shreds their sandals, the pointy and scratchy tips scratching and wounding their calves and legs. If it was some sort of pain endurance test, then they were actually failing it miserably. The choice was pretty simple actually. One could dodge the shurikens and end with his foot in a patch of thorns, resulting in a lowered speed and pain, or look where one was putting his feet and end up with steel shurikens embedded in their sides and arms, resulting in pain and possibly death by blood loss. Their sensei was obviously not aiming at their eyes or any point where a major artery was running, but the risk was there all the same. They didn't know she was actually only throwing one real shuriken every 5 or 6, the rest were just painted wooden ones. Their senses could not tell the difference in weight or speed after all, but Yojao could. The purpose of the training exercise was simple, to be able to concentrate on 2 different things at the same time. When they could correctly discern where to place their feet while keeping an eye out on the shurikens, they would have passed their test. Sai was of course downplaying his abilities, Yojao knew that much. Surprisingly, both Naruto and Sakura were actually quick to catch on, and the boy's wounds weren't even bleeding to begin with. She supposed it had to be another one of those Kyuubi-induced effects on his physique. Yojao threw one of the last volleys, this time purposefully aiming at Sai at full strength. The pale-skinned boy had barely the time to duck and end with most of his upper body against a bush, having squatted down near it. The noise of fabric ripping up made Yojao smirk as she launched the second-to-last volley straight at Sai once more. The metal shuriken in the mix of wood ones aimed for the boy's left ankle. It was a low trajectory, there was no way it could actually hurt him in the long run. Sakura was the closest one, and she valiantly took ahead to suffer the brunt of the attack in the stead of her teammate. The metal shuriken did graze her lower leg, but nothing more than a glancing wound that the fabric itself deadened much. Sakura! Naruto exclaimed next, moving closer to his 2 teammates. Yojao just smirked and threw again. The space between the shurikens widened, fanning the apparently deadly steel against both Sakura and Sai at the same moment. She actually expected Naruto to choose in the split second remaining before they struck to stand in front of either of his teammates. She didn't expect him to actually tackle Sai and Sakura to the ground. The shurikens passed by harmlessly above their heads, and with that Yojao clapped her hands and signaled the end of the training session. Very well done, she said. Now get out of that patch of bushes and over to the side. Anyone needs to be patched up. I'm fine, sensei, Naruto remarked. I'm not even bleeding. Lucky you, Sakura grumbled, wincing as she wobbled her way out of the vegetation. She sat down with a low-pitched whine, before taking out a few pieces of gauze and bandages from her jacket's inner pockets. Disinfectant came next, and as the girl began to treat herself, Sai turned his gaze to a hand that was apparently standing a few centimeters from his face. Here, Naruto answered. You've got a bad scratch on your cheek. Thank you, dickless, Sai muttered back, grabbing the disinfectant-filled cotton swab. Well then, Yojao moved her right hand in her own Jounin's flak jacket, before removing a few slips of paper. These are the papers for the exam. All of you must sign and then bring them to me tomorrow. If one of you doesn't participate, then none of you will, the Umbu woman finished handing over the papers, before remarking. I will see you tomorrow at the academy's entrance. Before any of the genin could say anything, their sensei flickered away. Damn it, Sakura cussed slightly. There goes plan A. Cherry? What plan A? Sai asked. Ah, well, sheepishly, Sakura looked downcast. My parents, they wanted reassurance about the Chunin exams and my preparation for them. They heard they can be pretty bloody and whatnot, and they're afraid for me since Ino's death. Naruto flinched. He couldn't help it. For the last time, Naruto. Sakura exclaimed, having caught on. It wasn't your fault. Yeah, all right, Naruto nodded slowly back to the pink-haired girl. So, what's the problem? The problem is, they wanted me to invite the whole team for dinner, sensei included. Are you sure? Naruto asked softly. His eyes glazed over for a moment, melancholically displaying a small grimace on his lips. Yes, I'm sure, Sakura rolled her eyes. They're fine with it, and no, you can't bail out. I'm using the teammate card. She exclaimed, pointing her right index finger at Sai. You've got to help out a teammate, right? Sai remained frozen on his spot for a moment, before finally nodding once. Is a gift required, Cherry? No, she shook her head strongly. But please avoid talking about those things, all right? She stammered out with a slight blush. Sai cocked his head to the side. Drawings. Since when do you speak about your drawings? Sakura yelled, her meek composure gone in a flash. I'm talking about dicks. I nearly forgot, Sai said then with the most serious tone. When did you become so kinky, chair? Shan narrow. The fist slammed into Sai's right cheek, sending the boy to barrel and roll back into the bushes in a cloud of dust. Huff, ah. Sakura sighed. Tonight at 7, Naruto, she finished talking to the raven boy. And no gift needed. Really? Just be prepared to be asked a lot of questions, that's pretty much all. Alright, Naruto looked up to the sky, the sun already starting to descend. I'd better hurry home and change then. It was in that moment, maybe aided by the fact the sun was in that position, or because she felt too tired to properly think it through, that Sakura did something she hadn't planned on doing. She kissed Naruto on the cheek. Thank you, Naruto-kun. The next instant, the girl took in Naruto's wide eyes. Those were soon followed by a slight blush on his face. She stood puzzled for a second, before it finally hit her too what she had just done. Her eyes widened even more. I think. She stuttered. Ilga homiandwarn maparanti iasunhan. She blurted out as fast as she could before running away. Naruto didn't actually understand what the girl had said, but then again he didn't even move from his spot until Sai came out of the thorny bushes, looking visibly scuffled. That meant he was actually quite pissed and with a slight frown on his face. Dickless. No answer came back. Dickless. Still nothing was said. Sai brought his right hand in front of Naruto, before snapping his fingers directly to the Uzumaki's face. When even that failed to work, he did the only thing he could think of. There's ramen behind you. Naruto twitched, before turning around and finally ending his apparent petrification. Ah, right. Yes. Of course. He muttered and half-stammered. Have to go. See you tonight, Sai. Bye. And Sai was left alone, pondering just what had happened in the brief moments he had been busy removing thorns from himself. That night, Sakura was hurriedly pacing circles in her home's kitchen. She was furiously gnawing at her lips, and then at her nails, and then back to her lips. She was also crunching on some elongated and crusty strips of bread, anything to try and forget what she had done. It had been the spur of the moment. There hadn't been any secret meaning behind. She had just been thankful for her teammates' decision to help her out in convincing her parents that no, she was not going to her death. Her team was strong, and they were the best. With Naruto and Sai there really was nothing the exam could send their way that they couldn't face. Sakura, stop pacing, her mother remarked dryly. You'll leave a dent in the floor. There won't be late, she blurted out. They'll probably be on the clock, both of them. Mabuki nodded to herself. She returned to the stove, giving just a passing glance at the clock. She was actually startled when there was a polite knock at the door. The split second the hour arm of the clock reached the number 7. It's them. Excitedly, Sakura literally ran from her spot to the door. Sakura! No running! Mabuki snapped back without any heat in her voice. It had been so long since her daughter had acted that way to begin with, she sighed as she fondly recalled the times when it would be the Yamanaka girl coming around to play with her daughter. Sakura had always been a bundle of energy back then, but she was prone to closing herself off the moment something bad happened. When she was made fun of, she would usually return home and close herself in her room. When she and Ino fought over Sasuke, she ended up not talking to anyone else for 1 week. Seeing her jumping on her feet as she made presentations was actually endearing in its own way for her motherly heart. What mother doesn't wish for her child to be happy to begin with? Kaizashi was actually scowling with his own patented father-trademarked glare at the two boys, who both seemed to be proper gentlemen in their own right. "Well, dinner's ready," she cheerfully said just before Kaizashi could get a word into any of her daughter's teammates. The usual compliments of the cook done, a slightly awkward silence settled in. Sakura was tense. She looked like a spring ready to jump in an instant, but against who or what, Mabuki had no idea. It was the moment Sai opened his mouth to say something that a piece of bread hastily concealed in her daughter's palm found its way to the boy's throat. Mabuki's eyes widened at that display of skill, especially when the boy was then subjected to a Heimlich maneuver by the other boy, Naruto. "Sakura." Kaizashi chided his daughter. "Sorry," she sheepishly replied. "Just acted on reflex." "I feel there's a story behind this," Mabuki smiled as she began to crack the ice over the silence. "So, Naruto, how's Sakura doing?" "Ah, well, she's doing great." "Yeah, really. She's Chiryunin no doubt." He quickly stammered out, nodding as fast as he could. "He's approved," Kaizashi took that moment to point out. "He can't lie to save his life. That's always a good quality." "Dad." Sakura's affronted exclamation was met with Sai quipping in. "Sakura-san is a proficient kunoichi." Naruto's breath was taken away. Sakura locked eyes with Sai as if waiting for the punchline. Both looked at one another for confirmation they weren't dreaming, before they turned once more to Sai, who was sipping water calmly. "She has become a skilled trap maker, and will without a doubt provide a solid asset during the exams," he added then. "I'm dreaming," Sakura muttered. "Sai's acting civil." "Sakura." Mabuki chided her. "That's not nice to say. He looks like a proper guy too. Are you a musician by hobby perchance, Sai? You have nimble fingers so." Sai cocked his head to the side. Sakura tensed. Naruto prepared himself with the hand. "I draw," he admitted softly. "I enjoy it." "How nice," Sakura's mother said with a small smile. "Do you have any drawings with you?" Naruto and Sakura were pinching each other, even as Sai rummaged through the inner pockets of his jacket to take out a small notebook. It was filled with pencil drawings, filled with random things going from trees to animals, passing by normal street views of the city. Mabuki was actually in love with the neat lines and the simplicity. Kaizashi actually let his eyes wander over both the boys his daughter had as teammates. They were both orphans, and while they seemed so different, they actually had the same way of acting. It was as if they didn't wish to intrude, the both of them with their shoulders dropped and their gaze settled on neither his nor Mabuki's face. He knew that type of reaction. He was an orphan himself, orphaned when the war took away his family after an Iwagakuer bombing run near the village he lived, before being transferred to Konoha's orphanage. When they had found out he couldn't use chakra, he had been moved to a civilian school, and that had been that. He had become a baker soon afterwards. He relished the taste of bread after all. It was the first thing he had eaten after they had found him, starved and wounded, beneath the rubble of what once had been his home. He cheerfully smiled, before saying, "Now, we should eat before the food gets cold. Nice drawings, by the way. Think you can make a portrait?" Sai nodded, his gaze back on his plate. "Drawing portraits is what I like the most. You can draw anyone, living or not, in them." Naruto looked at his teammate with a mixture of acknowledgement and longing, before he finally added in his two chosen words. "You don't have to worry about Sakura, sir," he said then. "We're teammates. We look out for each other. Unless we die, there's no way they'll get to her. Plus, she's the one in the rearguard too." Kaizashi was touched, and was about to say something when Sai said, his face completely straight. "I think she enjoys watching our back," he commented thoughtfully. There was a beat of silence. "She's kinky cherry like that." Sai. "I'm going to murder you, Shan Nero." Sakura screamed as she hurled herself across the table with her hands grabbing at the boy's clothes. And like that the tension was completely broken, as laughter filled the dining room soon afterwards. Outside the house, watching with a spyglass from a nearby rooftop, Jiraiya sighed as a smile was etched on his face. She's got the same character as Tsunade, he muttered to himself. If you say so, Jiraiya-sama, the female voice near him didn't startle the old shinobi even for a second. He had heard her coming his way since the beginning. Keeping an eye out for your team. It is not uncommon for enemy Jounin-sensei to scout the houses of the enemy village in search of genin competitors from previous exams or who have yet to take part. Naruto's and Sai's current arrangements are satisfactory to defend themselves, but Sakura's civilian family is a risk factor. So you're going to be here all night starting tonight. Jiraiya whistled in appreciation. That's dedication. Thank you. And it's also stupid if you don't tell them personally, he finished. The woman flinched slightly, before replying. But the target which is protected without knowing. That's Umbu wording. You're talking about trying to earn their trust, albeit in a convoluted way like this one. Just be honest with them. Tell them the risks straight away or they'll plunge head on against them. He half closed his eyes for a moment, as if lost in thought. And tell them that giving up if things get messy is fine. The way of the shinobi isn't in the honorable death, but in fighting with cunningness and retreating to see another day of battle. I will pass along your message, Jiraiya-sama, Yojeo nodded, before returning her mask-covered face to the window that gave into the kitchen. Sakura had done pummeling Sai and was now eating in a cheerful way, sharing stories of training from what her lip reading could tell. You had them run tied to one another with monocles for an entire day. Jiraiya said then, giving her an appraising glance. Kinky. That's what Sai said too, Yojeo muttered back, crossing her arms over her chest. It was just a team-building exercise. Still, since Jiraiya of the Sunin had told her that, maybe she should try and manacle Hayate tomorrow? She blinked and the old shinobi was gone. Exhaling slowly, she returned to her post with her ration bar. She should have accepted the invitation of her student, but then again, her favorite dinner talk was about how to gut an enemy shinobi without being heard. She doubted they'd stomach it the same way her usual social circles would. The next morning, the day of the Chunin exams came. The trio was prepared and ready as much as they could be, stood hesitantly in front of their sensei that was waiting for them outside the academy. She actually looked concerned. Her gaze softened as she straightened their necklines and checked their clothes. Grumbling an affirmative acceptance, she silently passed over to Sakura a bundle of explosive tags. Use them well, she whispered to the girl winking. And bring the boys home. Hi, sensei. Sai found himself with 2 vials of a murky green liquid in a pouch filled with herbal pills. Standard umbu poison and adrenaline pills. No more than 2 drops to kill, no more than 2 pills a week. Understood. Yojeo then moved to Naruto, and calmly handed him over an umbu-issued tanto. This one served me well. Don't lose it, don't break it, and come back to give it to me personally, understood? Naruto nodded firmly, strapping it to his side. It was then he realized there were 5 heavy military kunaus now stashed on his right side, followed by 2 metal bundles of barbed wires tightly packed in a leather pouch. She had to have placed them on his person while he hadn't been watching. She was good. Go in, 3rd floor, she said finally. And come back alive. Understood. Yes, sensei. They chorused, standing to attention for a brief moment. And, dismissed, Yojeo whispered, remaining there just long enough to watch them go. She disappeared in a flicker the moment Sakura's back left her view, jumping from roof to roof until she finally reached the Jounin lounge. Settling inside, she watched with vivid surprise as Kakashi was apparently standing against a nearby pillar, looking at Asuma Sarutobi with a fully powered glower of rage. What happened? She asked, before realizing Kurane Yui was standing nearby too. She had a piercing and icy glare on her face too. Why was everyone glowering at the man in question? Hadn't she a rookie team like hers? Maybe she had underestimated the competition, hadn't she? He stole both of my available genin, Kakashi grunted out. And he didn't even see fit to inform me. I now have a dysfunctional team that was never tested before and one more genin who thinks he was passed over because he does not belong to a clan, Kurane practically hissed. On paper, I have a tracking team now apparently. Inyazuka, Abarame, and Hyaga, 3 clan children, while he, pointing at Asuma, took Ami from Kakashi to complete the hole in his team when the 100-year-old genin refused to participate in the exams. There was a noise of grounding teeth now. What's worse, she added growling, is that he thought it would be nice to ask for the team changing in private with his father, rather than tell any of us beforehand. Asuma took a deep drag of his cigarette, before exhaling out a cloud of smoke. It's not my fault. No. Kakashi moved his head to the side. Then the Hokage came up with it. Asuma did not reply. Let's hope this doesn't turn into a bloodbath, Kurane muttered. From what little I saw, Kiba is boisterous beyond belief, Shino is distant and calculative but Hinata. You couldn't have done anything, Asuma said. Hayashi would have made his daughter participate anyway. They're locked in a heated discussion over the succession policy, since he had 2 daughters and not a single male. Some of the elders are in favor of rebutting the line back to Hisashi's son, which would mean turning a branch house member into a free main house one. Boy, the mess it must be, Kakashi remarked as he took out his copy of Ika Ika Teacher's Seductions. Oh no, Zojeo-sensei, we can't do it here, hush Sakura. Yojeo felt the need to slash the thing apart, for some reason. She resisted, if only because there was no way the thing could actually refer to her. The microtransmitter she had placed in her student's clothes began to buzz, as she moved her earcom tighter in to listen on the conversations they were having. You placed a microphone on your team. Kurane exclaimed, making her wince and startling both Asuma who had been lazily smoking, and Kakashi who was currently at the part with the horrible and evil thorn bushes who tore apart the clothes of the skimpy and curvaceous sensei and her equally curvaceous student. Yojeo hissed. I'm trying to listen. Gamma 1, Sakura's voice came through crisp and clear. Acknowledged. Sai and Naruto remarked a split second later. She took out a small booklet, and checked for the contingency in question. Harmless genjutsu. On the second floor, I overheard Katetsu and Izumo placed something to keep the genin on their toes, Kakashi pointed out. Sigma Theta 6. Was barely whispered, meaning a shinobi with training in taijutsu primarily. Gamma 9. Naruto's voice quipped in, seemingly in pain. Negative. Really, you two? I'm sorry Lee, but my heart is already taken. Sakura's voice came again. There was a bit of static, she had to admit it, but at least she could. Gamma 2000. Gamma 2000. Naruto, stop it. It's immature. Sakura's voice was growing annoyed. Yosh. Yojeo winced as she removed the earplug from her ear, throwing it on the table as held her throbbing side from the pain of the yell. What happened? Kurane asked then in worry. Guy, Yojeo hissed. His sensei was apparently there. Probably went inside to say his last goodbyes, how he expects his student to survive. Kakashi muttered. There is a limit to headstrongness. To Yojeo's puzzled gaze, Kakashi smiled before adding. He has one student whose chakra pathway is completely screwed up. He has barely enough to dispel a simple genjutsu, once. He passed the academy through taijutsu and written tests, but he had to make after images rather than bunshin to pass. That is a grievous mistake, Yojeo mumbled. I would never accept him in a team. He is a liability to any moderate genjutsu user. Guy is a special. And it was in that moment, that a spandex-wearing, bright green monstrosity with thick eyebrows dashed inside. Yosh. Hello there. Yojeo disappeared a moment later. Was being a Jounin sensei what made them strange? She was starting to regret not having remained in Umbu, but then again when the Hokage asks, you just don't refuse. At the same time as Yojeo Izuki was looking for a place to quietly listen on his students once more, her team was standing in a corner of the ante-room for the examination. Few people stood in the room, but all those that were there clearly had bypassed the genjutsu in the hallway without a second glance. Naruto's eyes traveled across the room, scanning for potential threats. The fact the Kyuubi was growling lightly at the back of his head however, it didn't bode well. Shukaku. Kurama murmured. Interesting. Naruto's throat felt parched suddenly, as a spike of pain erupted through his body, forcing him to tense and move backwards against the wall. I feel it is time I make myself known. Naruto hissed as his skin began to feel as if someone was actually boiling it. Concentrate now, Naruto, don't appear weak. The Kyuubi mocked him. He felt a pure and unbridled wave of rage and hatred pour through his soul. His first thought was to tear apart Sakura's face that loomed so close to him, but he fought it back down. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't angry at no one. Why? He choked out barely. Just as it had come about, it disappeared. The seal always takes, I fight it, normally, giving you but a mere trickle. If I wish, I could burst the pipes and give you it all, you would kill everyone nearby, but after all that isn't something that concerns me. No, the reason is, I wanted to get his attention. His. Naruto? Who are you talking to? You, a red-haired boy with the Suna symbol on his forehead walked forward suddenly, his two teammates nervously shadowing him. What is your name? The deep black circles around the boy's azure eyes were nothing compared to the crimson-red tattoo with the word love etched on his forehead. The teen had a gourd strapped to his back, and seemed to be eyeing him coldly, but with a dangerous glint of interest behind his eyes. Who wants to know? Sakura rebuffed the other boy, moving to stand in front of Naruto. Listen girl, the female teammate of the Sunanin said, just answer Gaara's question, alright. Tamari, shut up, he snapped at the girl, who winced and recoiled as if actually struck. Your name? Naruto. Naruto's fists clenched as he took a step forward. Mother wants your blood, Gaara whispered with a dreamy voice. And she will have it. The doors slid open then, admitting the rest of the genin who had been kept outside by the genjutsu. In the middle of the confusion, Gaara snorted and turned to leave. But not until you learn to fear my name. Shukaku. The Kyuubi's voice whispered with what seemed like genuine longing. You were always the most eager to please our father, he chuckled. Let us see then, let us see who fares better between misery and hate. And to those words, the Chunin exams began with a scarred man entering the room. Check the description for the links to the author.